That short film from Project Everyone is a rallying call, the world's to-do list, and it's a powerful message. To open today's meeting and to share his thoughts on what it will take to get the goals done is the UN Secretary-General, His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres. Welcome, Mr. Secretary-General.
So we can't see program yet?
Excellencies, guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Our world is challenged like never before, from climate change to conflicts to COVID-19, which is putting the Sustainable Development Goals further out of reach. It would be easy to lose hope. But we are not hopeless or helpless. We have a path to recovery if we choose to take it. That's what this SDG moment is all about. Coming together to save our planet and each other. Coming together also with the BTS today, which is a fantastic contribution. Now, 2 weeks ago, I launched our common agenda, a plan to reboot the multilateral system and gather the world around our common objectives. Because only by recovering together can we get the Sustainable Development Goals back on track. And I see 5 areas for urgent action. First, we need to end this pandemic. Our response has been too slow and too unequal. I call on the world to mobilize behind a global vaccination plan that doubles vaccine production to reach 70% of the world's population by the middle of next year. Second, we need to get down to the business of a sustainable and equitable recovery for all so that we stay on track to end poverty by 2030. And this means making bold investments in systems that support human development, from education and universal social protection to healthcare and jobs. It means putting people above profits, including through progressive taxation and ending tax evasion, money laundering, and illicit financial flows. And it means reforming the global financial system, tackling debt distress, and ensuring that developed countries benefit from the recent allocation of special drawing rights. Third, equal rights for women and girls. We cannot achieve any of the SDGs without gender equality. We need bold investments to make sure every girl has a seat in the classroom and the skills she needs to chart her own future. We need to dismantle the power structures that allow discrimination, violence, and economic hardship to keep 1/2 of humanity down. And we need to make sure that girls and women have a seat at every table, from the halls of power to the boardrooms of business. Quatrièmement,
fourth, we need to end the war on our planet. This means committing to zero emissions by 2050. Ambitious climate and biodiversity plans. No new coal plants after 2021, and mobilising $100 billion a year for climate action, and helping developing countries make the shift to green economies, a top priority of the upcoming COP26 meeting in Glasgow.
We need you, all of you. All of you are critical to global recovery. I urge you to work with your governments to put people first in their budgets and recovery plans. Dear friends, the pathway is there. The choice is ours. Let's move forward with hope and conviction, and I thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Secretary-General, for underscoring the fact that we are neither hopeless nor helpless. and also for setting out the 5 key priorities for our recovery and beyond. I'm sure we'll no doubt hear more throughout the day. And next, I have the honor of introducing His Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, President of the 76th Session of the United National General Assembly, the Global Town Hall of our Global Village. Welcome, Mr. President.
Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to speak at the second SDG Moment, an invaluable platform in our joint efforts to deliver on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. As we are all aware, the pandemic has severely impacted the SDGs. But the irony is that the SDGs themselves provide us the most comprehensive and universal toolkit in our efforts to recover sustainably. The decade of action launched in 2020 will now need to be a decade of recovering sustainably. Excellencies, my promise for a presidency of hope during this 76th session of the General Assembly is underpinned by 5 rays of hope, each intrinsically connected to the SDGs. Our first and second rays of hope on recovering from COVID-19 and rebuilding sustainably correspond directly to SDG 3 on good health and well-being, as well as SDG 8 on jobs and economic growth. The third ray on responding to the needs of the planet corresponds to a multitude of SDGs, including SDG 7 on clean energy, SDG 13 on climate action, and SDG 14 on the ocean and seas. And our final 2 rays covering human rights and UN revitalization cut across and uphold the entirety of the SDG agenda. Why else pursue such ambitious goals if not to respect and enhance the rights of the people everywhere? How better to achieve than through a multilateral system that is equipped to do just that? In essence, ladies and gentlemen, the workings of getting the SDGs back on track are our shared responsibility. The General Assembly can and is willing to play a part. Going forward, the gaps in political will and resource commitment remain a common fault line in our resolve to progress the SDGs. This must change. We need to ensure that countries, in particular the LDCs, LLDCs, and the SIDS, have access to adequate resources and capacity support in their efforts to recover from the pandemic and achieve the SDG targets. Like everything else on policy, there is no one-size-fits-all. For this very reason, the SDG Moment and platforms such as the ECOSOC's High-Level Political Forum offer an opportunity to reflect on where we are, where we could be, and what is holding us back, and the way forward. I encourage all to share success, best practices, lessons learned, challenges, and failures alike to achieve the SDGs. Only together, through effective collaboration and meaningful cooperation, we will learn to find the best way to move forward. Let the setback that the world has seen strengthen our resolve and reinforce our determination to recover from the pandemic, to build sustainably and achieve the SDGs. Together, it is possible, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for those encouraging words. We can't measure progress without the right metrics. So before we go any further, let's get a reality check on SDG progress 6 years after their adoption. We're joined in the SDG studio by Ms. Claire Casey, the Global Head of Policy and Insights at Economist Impact.
When world leaders came together in 2015 to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, we all knew the challenge ahead of us. And we've made progress, but it has been hard-won, uneven, and fragile. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us just how fragile. Today, humanity faces a stark and urgent choice. Do we allow these fractures to grow, or do we break through to a greener, safer, and more equitable future? At Economist Impact, we're dedicated to driving positive change by using data and evidence to better understand the biggest issues and evaluate the best solutions. And we've been closely tracking action on the SDGs. Today, as we explore progress against the Sustainable Development Goals, let's remember, we know what we have to do, and we have the tools. The question is, do we have the will to act and keep the promise of Agenda 2030? Let's start with Goal 1, eliminating extreme poverty by 2030. In just 18 months, the COVID-19 pandemic erased 5 years' worth of progress, pushing more than 97 million people back into extreme poverty. If we don't take action now to right our course, we risk arriving at 2030 with more than 600 million people living in extreme poverty. We also know we can't move forward without women and girls. Since 2015, we've made progress on gender equality, but not nearly enough. Maternal mortality continues to fall, but we need to move more than 4 times faster if we're to achieve our target of 70 deaths for 100,000 live births by 2030. In politics, women now hold 26% of seats in national parliaments. But at the current rate of improvement, it will take no fewer than 40 years to achieve gender parity. And when we look at the workforce, women are still grossly underrepresented, with less than half of women participating compared to more than 70% of men. This hasn't budged since 2015. COVID has only exacerbated these disparities. Female-dominated industries were disproportionately affected across both formal and informal sectors. The number of women employed declined by 54 million in 2020. As COVID impoverishes communities, closes schools, and reduces access to reproductive health care, it's estimated that 10 million more girls than previously projected are at a risk of becoming child brides through 2030. The risk of violence has also risen. Before the pandemic, we knew that 1 in 3 women would experience violence at least once in her lifetime. During the pandemic, some countries reported a devastating 5-fold increase in calls to helplines. When we talk about gender equality, we tend to address it through this humanitarian lens. But equality doesn't just benefit individuals. It benefits whole societies and economies. Achieving gender equality could unlock $12 trillion. The opposite is also true. Nations that fail women fail. One powerful tool to ensure equality of opportunity across communities and around the world is connectivity. And this is an area where we've made tremendous progress. 4 billion people around the world are connected to the internet, 1 billion of whom came online since 2015. But COVID has acted sort of like a time machine, hurtling us all forward into a digital future in which we access our jobs, our education, healthcare, financial services, even our friends and family, all online. So for those 3 billion people still unconnected, the costs have never been higher. 1/3 of children globally were unable to access remote learning during COVID lockdowns, and we saw the immediate impact. 101 million children fell below minimum reading proficiency levels in 2020. We also know the returns we get from investments in connectivity. They're massive. Connecting schools to the internet boosts GDP by up to 20% in least connected countries. It also shows how intertwined the SDGs are. An increase in connectivity can contribute to increases in educational outcomes, prosperity, and gender equality. But a prerequisite to meaningful connectivity is access to reliable, affordable electricity. And after years of good progress, we've lost ground here as well. In 2020, we saw the number of people without electricity in Africa increase for the first time in 6 years. Without major changes today, we could reach 2030 with 660 million people living without access to power. Expanding electricity must be addressed within the context of the ongoing worsening crisis that is climate change. Only by unleashing the power of clean energy will we be able to end energy poverty while protecting our planet. After a brief pause in 2020 when we all stayed home, emissions are back on the rise. Climate change is not a future challenge. We're already feeling its impact. The economic costs from extreme weather and wildfires were $1.3 trillion over the last 10 years. That's a 40% increase from the previous decade. And if we continue on this course, we will create an unlivable planet with the greatest suffering borne by those least responsible. In 2015, the world came together in Paris to commit to limit global warming, and we've made important progress since then. The cost of renewables continues to decline. Clean power is now often the most affordable option, and low-carbon fuels have surpassed coal as the largest source of electricity generation. But as we look towards COP26 in Glasgow this November, it must be with clear eyes. Our policies are grossly insufficient to meet the present challenge. Our research tells us that more governments and businesses are turning their attention to this issue than ever before, but it's not enough. We must act now to prevent the worst. COVID was a wake-up call and a model for what's possible. It showed us what happens when an abstract threat becomes very real. In 2020 alone, governments mobilized and deployed $14 trillion in pandemic support. Through unprecedented public and private collaboration, we developed and deployed safe and effective vaccines faster than anyone imagined. We did it because we had to. A sustainable, inclusive future demands we act with the same urgency. Governments, businesses, civil society working together. To achieve the promise of Agenda 2030, we will need partnerships and collective action, technology and innovation, effective institutions and delivery mechanisms, better data to set baselines and track our progress, and a relentless focus on our responsibility to future generations and to those most at risk of being left behind. We are 1 year into the decade of action. It is time to act.
Our thanks to Ms. Casey on the very sober and clear-eyed look at what has to be done to get the SDGs back on track. And as we heard earlier from the UN Secretary-General, doing so is going to require action from all actors and the engagement of all people, especially youth, which is why we're therefore pleased and, as a Korean American, distinctly honored to be joined by His Excellency, Mr. Moon Jae-in, the President of the Republic of Korea, to deliver a statement and to introduce a very special guest. Welcome, Mr. President.
President Abdullah Saeed, Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, distinguished delegates, I am extremely delighted to join you at SDG Moment 2021, and I am grateful for inviting me to this special occasion. A research institute of the United Nations recently released a report that found that all disasters in the world are interconnected. For instance, the heat wave in the Arctic and cold wave in Texas, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic and Cyclone Amphan that hit Bangladesh, are closely connected with one another through the links of carbon emissions and environmental destruction. If the problems are interconnected, then so be the solutions. When humanity transcends national boundaries to work together, that in and of itself would be first step towards surmounting a crisis. Right in this hall 6 years ago, the UN agreed to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, and 2 years ago, it proclaimed the Decade of Action until 2030. Humanity's strides towards an inclusive future were held back by COVID-19. Yet, ironically, it was the very pandemic that brought home the desperate need for SDGs. Our commitment to action grew stronger. We must move ourselves beyond simply overcoming the crisis to build back better and stronger. If actions that we take together are interconnected, we will deliver without a doubt. First, our commitment to inclusion and mutual prosperity must be immediately put into action now. That action can begin with an equitable access and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines by the international community. At G7, the Republic of Korea made a $200 million pledge to COVAX AMC. As one of the global vaccine hubs, we're committed to making continued endeavors to expand vaccine supply and support. Taking a step further, we stand ready to actively contribute to strengthening international health cooperation at WHO, among others. Second, we must collaborate beyond our borders in responding to the climate crisis. Our planet is getting hotter faster than anticipated, with extreme weather events occurring one after another in every part of the world. Carbon neutrality is a goal that developed and developing countries alike must move towards in tandem. To this end, leading countries in climate action must partner with developing countries by sharing their experiences and transferring technologies. Korea plans to finalize its 2050 carbon neutrality scenario by the end of October and submit its updated NDC at COP26. Korea will scale up Green New Deal ODA and share its experience and technology as a nation that has grown from a developing to a developed one, thus actively supporting developing countries in their endeavors towards green recovery and carbon neutrality. Third, sustainable development demands that we fully harness the fourth industrial revolution technologies. Digital technologies and infrastructure, however, engender new divides and inequalities at the same time. Addressing the digital gap and inequalities thus presents another challenge of our time. These are the problems that we also encounter in energy transition process. Our digital and green transitions, therefore, must be inclusive and leave no one behind.
마지막으로
Lastly, we must respect our future generations and gather the wisdom for intergenerational coexistence. We must move beyond our differences in ideas and cultures across generations. All generations, as we strive to transcend the boundaries of nationality, race, and gender, to communicate and connect to one another, must recognize that, after all, we are part of a global community. For poverty, inequality, climate change, and other crises that remain unresolved by older generations, the voices of future generations must be heard more attentively, as so doing would indeed be a duty asked of the older generations. Fearing change, the older generations have left many problems unsolved, yet the younger generations' sensitivity and capacity for empathy may find us the solutions. We must not forget, in particular, that the future belongs to our future generations. Joining us today are an exceptionally outstanding group of young men who are connecting with the youth across the world, BTS, in the capacity as a special presidential envoy for future generations and culture. Together with BTS, the first ever special envoy from the private sector, I hope today's gathering will serve as an opportunity to mobilize the future generations' goodwill and action towards sustainable development. Guided by the conviction that no one is safe until everyone is safe, the Korean people will join the journey of inclusive international cooperation as your most reliable, steadfast companion, leaving no one behind. Thank you.
이제 제가
So I am going to introduce the next speaker to the podium. Probably the artist that is most loved by people around the world. Who have been designated as the Special Presidential Envoy for Future Generations and Culture. We're going to listen to their story, the BTS. Your Excellency Abdullah Shahid, President of the 76th United Nations General Assembly, Your Excellency Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, Your Excellency President Moon Jae-in, and distinguished leaders from around the world. It is an honor to be here today, where BTS appointed as special presidential envoys of the Republic of Korea. We're here today to share the stories of our future generation. Before we came here, we asked the young people in their teens and 20s around the world about their past 2 years and about the world they find themselves in today. Jin will share some of the answers we received. Yes, should we take a look? You can feel the good vibes from just looking at these. There were times during the past 2 years when I too felt bewildered and troubled. But still here, we have people who cry out, let's live on, let's make the best of this moment. Because we can't stand still when we are in the ideal time of our lives to take on new challenges. It wasn't as if we could blame anyone, and you must have felt the frustration. Here I'm the same as I was yesterday, but the world changed like we were transported in a flash to a parallel world. I was saddened to hear that entrance and graduation ceremonies had to be canceled. These are moments in life you want to celebrate, and missing out on them must have been upsetting. We were heartbroken when our long-planned concert tours were canceled. And for a while, we yearned for the moments we wanted to make complete. Yes, it was a time for us to mourn for the things that COVID took away from us. A time to discover how precious each and every moment we taken for granted were. Suga mentioned the precious things we'd taken for granted, and lots of people answered our question by sharing pictures of their precious moments. Many people showed how they share their moments with nature. I think during these 2 years, they found dear the time they experienced and care for nature. Yes, but maybe because we feel an encroaching sense of dread that our time on this earth is limited, we just talked about the things we mourn, and I shudder to think about mourning for the earth. Everyone agrees that climate change is an important problem, but talking about what the best solution might be, that's not easy. It's a topic that's tough to make conclusions about. Yes, it is a tough discussion, but I learned while preparing for today that there are many young people who have an interest in environmental issues and choose it as their field of study. The future is unexplored territory, and that's where we, more than anyone, will spend our time. So these young people were searching for the answers to the question of how we must live that future. So I hope we don't just consider the future as grim darkness. We have people who are concerned for the world and searching for the answers. There are still many pages left in the story about us, and I thought we shouldn't talk like the ending's already been written. Of course, sometimes the world seems stuck in place even if you're ready to go. Sometimes it feels like you've lost your way. There was a time when we felt the same way. I've heard that people in their teens and 20s today are being referred to as COVID's lost generation, that they've lost their way at a time when they need the most diverse opportunities and must try new things. But I think it's a stretch to say they're lost just because the paths they tread can't be seen by grown-up eyes.
Yes, take a look at these pictures. Here we have many who are trying hard to continue their friendships online in new ways, start learning new things, live healthier lives. I'm sorry, excuse me.
네, 새롭게 공부를 시작하고 더
Yes, these kids are trying to learn new things and trying to figure new things out. They don't look lost. They look like they are finding new courage and taking on new challenges. I think that's why instead of the lost generation, a more appropriate name would be the welcome generation. Because instead of fearing change, this generation says welcome and keeps forging ahead. That's right. If we believe in possibilities and hope, even when the unexpected happens, we will not lose our way, but discover new ones. There will be choices we make that may not be perfect, but that does not mean there will be nothing we can do. That's what I think. What is important are the choices we make when we're faced with change, right? Some of you heard the news that we're coming to the UN, and a lot of you were wondering whether we have been vaccinated. And I'll take this opportunity to say yes. All 7 of us, of course, we received vaccinations. The vaccination was a sort of ticket to meeting our fans waiting for us and to being able to stand here before you today. Just like we said in our message today, we too are doing the things that we're able to do right now. Like the vaccinations, efforts are continuously underway to keep this new reality going forward. And I think the day we can meet again face to face is not far away. Until then, I hope we can fill each of our days to the brim with positive energy. We thought the world had stopped, but it continues to move forward. I believe that every choice we make is the beginning of change, not the end. I hope that in this nascent new world, we can all say to each other, welcome. And now, as we look forward to this future, the permission to dance is our message of welcome that we want to share with everyone today.
It's so that opinion when your heart's just like a drum, beating louder with no way to guard it.
When it all seems like it's wrong, say along to Elton John, to that feeling we're just getting started.
And when the nights get colder and the rhythm's got you falling behind, just dream about that moment when you look yourself right in the eye. Then you say, I wanna dance, the music's got me going, and nothing that can stop how we move. Yeah, let's make our plans to live just like a golden and rolling like we're dancing fools. We don't need to worry, just ready for we know how to dance.
Don't need to talk the talk, just walk the walk tonight.
'Cause we don't need permission to dance. There's always something that's standing in the way, but if you don't let it phase you, you know just how to put just get that right.
Yeah, yeah, there's no looking back. There ain't no one to prove we don't got this alright.
Yeah, so when it's over, the time is not so much to it right. Yeah, we keep going and stay up until we see the sunrise. And we say, I wanna dance, the music's got me going, and nothing that can stop how we move. Yeah, let's make a pass and leave just like it golden and rolling like it dancing fools. We don't need to worry, 'cause when we fall we know how to land. Don't need to talk the talk, just walk the walk tonight. 'Cause we don't need permission to dance. No, we don't need permission to dance. Well, let me show you, and then we can keep the fire alive.
'Cause it's not over till it's over. Say one more time.
Say, I wanna dance, the music's got me going, and nothing can stop how we move. Hey, let's make a plans and live just like it golden and rolling like it dancing fool. Like it dancing fool. We don't need to worry, 'cause when we fall we know how to
could take the wisdom and experience of established leaders and combine it with the talents and the innovation of youth? That's what we're talking about in today's discussion. What if it's not just one generation passing the baton to another, but multiple generations working and co-creating together? Well, we're being joined today by two intergenerational leaders who are doing just that. Each is using the SDG goals as a guide to focus their work and concentrate on creating together. We have legendary stateswoman, elder, and SDG advocate, Gracia Michel, who's championed education as a pathway for peace and prosperity for all, especially young women. We're also being joined by STEM activist and SDG advocate Valentina Muñez Ravanal, who at 19 years old has already helped write the first artificial intelligence policy in her home country of Chile. Thank you both for joining us.
Hello, thank you very much.
Ms. Gracia Michel, let me begin with you. You've said in the past that we are living through a crisis of consciousness and a crisis of leadership, frankly. How can intergenerational co-creation help fight this problem and be part of the solution?
Let me bring one example of what, as a member of the elders, we did exactly this. In celebration of Mandela's 100 years, we brought together civil society organizations across the globe, and I mean from all continents. And we brought activists who are working in peace, justice, climate change, human rights, education, women and youth empowerment, to really give the best of examples of what is going on the world from the grassroots. And this was an experience to bring the local to the global, bringing all continents together, men and women, old and young, and from different perspectives to reimagine a world of peace, a world where climate is not going to be aware, we will be able to protect our planet, to provide education to young generations, to bridge inequalities. And with this, we build a movement we called Walking Together for a Better Future. So I believe today we need to multiply these kind of initiatives, bringing all we can around the SDGs, recreating, reimagining, reinventing ways of recognizing dignity of every single human being across globe. And I believe that way we can implement the Sustainable Development Goals.
Valentina, you are an award-winning robotics engineer as well as the tip of the spear in artificial intelligence, both tools towards creating change. How do you think intergenerational cooperation can move forward?
Well, I think that around the world, especially in Latin America, it is thought that if you don't have a vote, you don't have a voice. And who has no vote? Children. And democracy is built around that idea, institutionalizing the way of doing politics, when the reality is that the personal is political, and each of our problems and strategies to combat them are political too. And there is no age to change the world. Malala and Greta Thunberg have proven it more than anything, that what we need is first to establish new forms of participation and political influence in which children and adolescents can be more than just spectators, but also protagonists of discussion and change. That it's some kind of thing that we made around the construction of the first national artificial intelligence policy in Chile, my country. We tried with UNICEF, with the Defensory of Childhood, and the Latin American Association of Young Women for Ideas to establish youth voices around political that involve us all. I think that this is a problem that has its roots really deep into our communities, starting into our families. And I think that there is the starting point. We can do something so simple, so basic, so easy as asking our children what do they think while we are having lunch or dinner. Our dinner table is the first place where children learn to be quiet. Let's change that. Why we can't change that? I encourage our children to think politically and to speak loud about what they think. That's how our dinner tables are going to become into decision tables. And that's how we're going to teach children that they don't need to ask for permission for saying what they think, because there are no others conversations, and they can conquer every other space that where they feel that belong and want to be a part of.
And Ms. Gracia Michel, in preparation for this conversation, I looked up old articles about you and saw photos of the young Gracia Michel, as fiery as ever today. I wonder what your concerns are, though, as you look out on the horizon about the future of working intergenerationally.
I think we need to build movements. Wherever we are and whatever we are concerned with and we are working. When you are one voice, you are weak. But when you bring people together and who think together and act together, that voice cannot be ignored. Whether it's regional, whether it is the UN, when we work together as movements, we remove the barriers which are preventing us from implementing what we have agreed upon. So I think the voice of everyone is to be listened to when it is articulate and representing aspirations of millions of people who come together. And then institutions will be forced to take into account. Governments will have to take into account. And I think now, for instance, the fact that the Secretary General has brought the advocates for SDGs, very young voices. I think it will shake people to listen and not to ignore. And we need to include even mechanisms of accountability.
Ms. Michel, clearly your wisdom and your experience over your lifetime is invaluable to this conversation. And yet, looking towards the future, what brings you hope?
Exactly, to be listening to Valentina, listening to Malala, listening to Eddie Ndlovu, listening to Greta Thunberg, these young, vibrant and dynamic young people who have embraced global issues, which we adults, perhaps we do not have any more creative ways of tackling them. And they come with their imagination, with their forcefulness, and they challenge us in a way perhaps we were not used to be. And for me, the hope is exactly to feel that this young generation is taking up responsibility. It brings fresh ideas, which are, in fact, they are scientifically well founded, and they encourage us to move forward. And these are the voices which are telling us that, like them, there are millions of young people like those. It's not the future, as Valentina is saying, it's the present, which is with us now, which is shaping a new future. So I listen with pleasure and with humility, and I feel in my heart that, the world is in good hands.
How does technology help create change for the future?
In October 18 from 2019, in my country, Chile, we wake it up, what we call it, the social outbreak, and started when the subway ticket had an increase of 30 Chilean pesos, and the Chilean students, children and teenagers, they evaded the payment of that ticket on protest for the increasement. It ended up with the biggest national march in the history of my country, all that because of youth. I think that that's my hope. Things are happening and youth is making that happen. I know we're changing the world, we just need the word to say it.
Audio in here? Yeah. I'm not getting audio.
You know, the Sustainable Development Goals speaks to issues of concern, issues which are affecting our everyday lives, wherever you are, whatever it's your age, whatever it's your profession. And because of that, I feel we need to just build bridges and complementarities to work together. Those who are in the political sphere, those who are in science, those who are in business, those who are researchers, those who are civil society organizations, is grassroots, those who are activists. Sustainable development goals have a task to every single one of us. Perhaps I will add that we need to build the social contracts. You can't be doing good if you don't have clarity on what your responsibilities are, what is the responsibility of others, and we have a space in which we take stock, we see what's going on well, what need to be corrected, but we make each one of us also accountable to move forward with the implementation of sustainable development goals. And I think these spaces of working together, but also of accountability, are important because we have been making some promises which are unmet. This is totally unacceptable. So those spaces of working together, accountability, and moving, encouraging every one of us that it is possible, it has to be done, it is for the good of all of us. Those spaces are needed for implementation of the SDGs.
Ms. Michelle, the wisdom of the elders, and Ms. Ravenel, the wisdom of our youth. Thank you both so much in joining us in conversation. Incredibly insightful. And thank you for joining us online.
Thanks, Juju, and certainly very inspiring words there from Ms. Michelle and Ms. Ravenel. Now, let's turn to the UN Secretary-General's opening remarks, where he outlined 5 areas where urgent action is needed to keep the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals. At the heart of this is ending the acute phase of the COVID-19 pandemic and leveraging the recovery and to accelerate transitions needed to achieve sustainable development across our unequal world. And haven't the vaccines taught us that? As we navigate this uncertain terrain, we have a unique opportunity to tackle systemic risks that have been ignored for decades. Fragility in health systems, gaps in social protection, an accelerating climate crisis, and deficits in global cooperation, among others. This can be the pandemic's silver lining. To dig deeper into what it will take to get the SDGs back on track, we have 2 esteemed speakers who will bring a wealth of experience and knowledge. First, here with me in studio, Mr. Achim Steiner, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme and Vice Chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group. Welcome, sir.
Hello, Jae-in.
Ms. Vera Songwe, Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, joins us virtually. Ms. Songwe, good to see you and welcome.
Good morning to you all. Good morning, Akim. Nice to see you too.
Hello, Vera.
To begin, I want to focus on the most pressing issue, saving lives and ending the pandemic. Having developed vaccines in record time, so far the world has failed to secure their equitable distribution. 80% of the vaccine doses have been administered in high and upper middle income countries so far. Just 2%, let me say that again, just 2% of the total has been administered in Africa. Truly damning statistics. Vera Songwe, Dr. Tedros of the World Health Organization recently mentioned some of the initiatives underway to increase access to COVID-19 vaccines globally. What is being done to increase vaccine access in Africa? And more importantly, What still needs to be done?
Thank you again for having us in this conversation. I think that what we are talking about here is healthcare, but healthcare is also about protecting jobs and about delivering prosperity. What do we still need to do? Of course, when you say 2%, 2% is not nearly where we need to be. Africa CDC and the director of Africa CDC have said that Africa needs to get to at least 70% vaccinated by the middle of next year. So that's the goal, that's the ambition, that's the target. What we're doing is we've sort of sliced those targets in 3 phases. We wanted to get to 10% vaccinated by the end of September and 30% vaccinated by the end of December. That means that we need to get the vaccines. We need to get the financing, then we need to get the vaccines. The African Union under President Cyril Ramaphosa, the President of South Africa, put together a team, the African Vaccines Acquisition Task Team, to see whether we could at least get to 30% of vaccines. We were able to do that, I'm happy to say, through very innovative financing engineering by Afrexim Bank, working together under the leadership of Strive Masiwiya, who is a multi-billionaire on the continent, but who is the task force and special envoy for these African dose vaccines. But it's not enough. We're just at 30%. The COVAX vaccine, which is the partnership part of this conversation, has not delivered what it's supposed to deliver. But that is also because we don't have access to the vaccines. Today, we're in a very interesting situation where Africa has the financial resources inside the African Union with the Afrexim Bank to purchase vaccines, but we don't have the vaccines to buy. The donors have offered to provide vaccines, but the donors don't have the vaccines to purchase either, because what we are seeing is a lot of anti-competitive, non-trade barrier measures that are being put in. We cannot export vaccines. No countries from the West are letting vaccines out until they've satisfied their populations. So we really do need to look at our trade agreements, open up that segment. But more importantly, we need to produce more vaccines on the African continent. Today, South Africa and Senegal already produce vaccines, but let's not forget that actually many African countries also produce vaccines for animals. And so we already have the technology. We could do more, we could do better. Yes, today we're talking about COVID vaccines, but there are 4 different diseases that kill, and I want to expand the conversation just a little bit. 30 million children suffer, and over 500,000 children die from vaccine-preventable diseases in Africa. 30 million children suffer, and 500,000 die from vaccine-preventable diseases on our continent. If we could produce those vaccines, retrovirus, pneumococcal diseases, measles, and rubella, with $13 billion a year of investment that we could get our private sector to do. Right. So I think it's not just about the COVID vaccine. We need to have a combination of different vaccines that we produce that can do that. Senegal, Rwanda, Ghana, right. Of course, Morocco and Egypt have all now begun to produce vaccines, but we need to ensure that we have a pool procurement mechanism that can then also buy the vaccines. And this is where we're working with WHO, UNICEF, and others to make sure, and COVAX, to make sure that not only is the production done, but also the purchase, because that's really what's the most important. Somebody must buy the vaccines when you produce them.
Let me bring you in here, Akim Steiner. Vera Song, we're talking there about the need for greater self-sufficiency within Africa, and I think that's part of the broader conversation here. UNDP and the WHO have recently launched a global dashboard with striking insights into the impact of vaccine and equity on socioeconomic recovery from COVID-19. What does your analysis tell us about where we currently are?
Well, building from where Vera left off, I think we are at the moment at that point where the challenge seems almost insurmountable, and yet we know that it is actually achievable. So some of the numbers that Vera presented to you just a moment ago, I think point to the enormity of the challenge. I mean, the global dashboard that we developed, WHO, UNDP, in partnership with the Blavatnik School at the University of Oxford, looks at the impact of equity, because one of the most brutal realizations, I think, out of this pandemic is that inequality defines a great deal of what happens after a pandemic starts. And certainly the dashboard shows at the moment that most wealthier countries are probably by the end of 2021 almost at the point where their GDP growth rates are back to pre-pandemic levels. And yet for low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, that is not the case at all. And that has everything to do with what Vera just spoke about, access and speed of being able to deploy vaccines. And we would anticipate that if indeed the world can now rally around these targets, the G20, but also others, governments, but the private sector, then indeed the target of getting 40% vaccination rates by the end of the year and then 70% by middle of next year would indeed be significant in terms of what happens next to our economies. And this is where people really are paying the highest price in the long term beyond the health impacts, namely poverty, loss of businesses, the inability of governments to even invest in recovery. And that is where the dashboard is a very useful indicator, country by country, of exactly how that is playing out right now.
Let me stay with you for a second. You've mentioned a number of factors. You haven't mentioned the issue of debt, right? We know that many developing countries are facing major funding challenges. How do we address these challenges now and into the future?
Well, I think first of all, we have to recognize that debt is a major constraint on countries to even be able to respond to the pandemic. So fiscal space has become a term that many have referred to, which is the reality that governments simply do not have the money.
I think they're referring to the lack of fiscal space.
Exactly, the lack of fiscal space, but this is the area in which governments, in a sense, define the response to the pandemic, be it in terms of access to protective equipment or is it access to vaccines. But the second part is the stabilization measures also. For instance, temporary basic incomes, trying to stabilize the 70–80% of people who earn their living in the informal sector. When they actually have to go into lockdown, when markets shut down, there is no social protection for most of them. So that is one challenge, the financing challenge. The debt challenge also in terms of trying to address the issue of growing levels of debt. We estimate that over 60 developing nations are facing debt distress potentially in the coming months or year. Now, the IMF recently, as some of you may know, established these special drawing rights. So there is a temporary reprieve to some extent, but it's only temporary. The debt mountain is growing, and for many countries it's going to become, especially if interest rates were to increase, a major problem. We need to act as a global economy. This is where the stimulus packages need to also address the issue of debt. And, you know, just 1% of the debt repayments this year would actually buy 1 billion doses of vaccines. So this gives you a sense of how these issues are interrelated. And anybody who argues there is nothing we can do about it is simply not telling the truth.
Vera Songwe, do you want to jump in here on the debt conversation? Akim points to the fact that the IMF has now delivered these special drawing rights. There's, of course, an argument that the quotas then favor more developed, richer countries that perhaps don't need that liquidity as much as some of the poorer countries in terms of this quota basis. What's your assessment of how this looks and how this plays itself out in Africa?
No, thank you. So just building up on what Akim said, the special drawing rights are this sort of huge injection of liquidity across the board. And so in that sense, some degree of fairness, one will think. $650 billion of new injections of capital into the world economy. Unfortunately, what we saw is Africa only got 5% of that $650 billion. So in real terms, $33.6 billion. So, 54 countries on the continent with $33.3 billion. The G7 countries, $282 billion. So what we are arguing on the continent, finance ministers and the UN together, actually, and not just for Africa, but globally, is we should have on-lending of the SDRs. So the SDRs, the developed world will argue, are important for reserves. But altogether, the SDRs in the developed world only constitute about 1% to 2% of their reserves. These SDRs, as Akim said, have a fundamental and important role to play, for example, in creating a vaccines facility, because the debt conversation is linked to this. If countries need to buy more vaccines, now we're talking about boosters and third doses, we're already struggling to get the first dose, and how much more debt are we getting into? So we're arguing that 25% to 30% of the SDR should be on-lent at US interest rates, and we hope they don't increase very quickly, to the developed world to create a vaccines facility to deal with, yes, regrowth, climate change, but also more importantly, look at this issue of expensive cost of borrowing, because countries are going to have to get out of this crisis and they're going to need market access, but they need to borrow at affordable and accessible rates. The SDRs, once in a century allocation to developing countries, can help us do this.
So Vera, in the one sense, we're talking about creating capacity, right, in a sustainable way for Africa to boost local production of COVID-19 vaccines. But then on the other hand, you're talking about not having the fiscal space and not having the money coming in from outside to support that kind of production. So it's kind of a circular nature. We're talking about two different things on two different tracks.
No. On the boosting of pharmaceutical manufacturing on the continent, again, like I said, with Afri-Exim Bank, we have been able to create new engineering and financial tools to actually provide for additional resources for this financing. And I think, again, one of the things that the African Vaccines Acquisition Task Team has demonstrated is that when Africans can, Africans, when Africans want, Africans can. Because, Africa got together and said, yes, we want COVAX, but COVAX is only 27%. It went to 30, but we need to get to 60. How do we do it? We looked at an African Development Bank and we said, can we financially engineer some resources to put a down payment to get those first doses. Now what we're doing is we're working with Aspen to see whether we can scale up Aspen. We're working with Senegal to see whether we can scale up Senegal. Yes, additional external resources are coming, but I think this is one area where we have demonstrated as a continent that we didn't need to wait for external resources to launch what was essentially Africa's human security survival, and where everybody was making sure that their human security and health security was first and foremost before you could come to Africa. So I think this is the message here, is that we don't need to wait. We can actually finance on the continent, but we need the SDRs, and we need on-lending of some of those SDRs to ensure that as we finance, we're not financing at expensive rates. And that's why we're also looking at the cost of debt and creating a facility like a liquidity and sustainability facility that could reduce substantially the cost of debt, because debt is really also about the interest that we pay on the resources that we're borrowing. At such negative and low interest rates in the developed world, why is Africa still going to the market at 7-8% when in a time when there is a crisis? I think that is a question we must answer, and we can use the SDRs to solve that problem.
Do you want to jump in there?
Just to agree, I think we are confronted with a situation where in many countries that can afford to go to financial markets, a pandemic is an exceptional situation. What is very frustrating is to watch how the wealthier world, and here the G20 really is at a moment in which it must stand its own test of time, because the G20 summit is only a few weeks away. On vaccines, there are very clearly decisions that these countries could take now, including what the multilateral leaders task force, in which the heads of the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, the WHO were represented, called for, which is to look, for example, at countries whose orders for vaccines are in excess of their needs, to repurpose them right now, to be able to make also the commitments that have been made on providing vaccines to countries. The 900 million doses that have been promised, only 10% of those have been shipped so far. That's one end of the equation. I think the other one, Shimon, is we're also talking about the goals, the SDGs, and I think one very important message in our discussion today must be that despite the setbacks that we have now seen, whether it is in Africa and Latin America, but frankly speaking, all over the world, actually it's the SDGs that provide us also with a framework to come out of this crisis from an economic, social, and an environmental point of view. And I think here, I would argue that we have both a public finance challenge, which is what we have just been talking about, but then we have an investment challenge also, because if the economy continues to invest in what it was, then we're not going to build forward better or build back better. We're actually just going to build back to where we were.
Right.
And that's where the SDGs become such a central rallying point, not just for UN meetings or for leaders of governments, but actually also for the private sector, the financial sector, what Vera was referring to with the Exim Bank. We need to move a financial system where the global wealth today is well over $400 trillion. Just 1.1% of that is what the estimate is roughly for an annual SDG investment push. And UNDP and many others are arguing that we actually need to have an SDG push scenario where we invest in coming out of this crisis, not to where we were before, but to another place. And that other place is actually perfectly achievable, but not if the financial markets, the banking sector, the financing system remain focused on the world pre-pandemic.
The UN Environment Programme shows that only 18% of announced recovery spending can be considered green, while your own analysis with UN Women showed a lack of strong focus on women's economic security recovery efforts, right? The women's equality issues, of course, are one of the other pandemics. What would it take to secure recovery that accelerates SDG implementation?
Very bold and courageous leadership. Clearly, governments do play a central role in the midst of a crisis. They send signals, whether it's fiscal policy signals, taxation signals, but also technology investment signals. The SDG push scenario is very much focused on governance, on social protection, on the green investment strategies, and also on digitalization.
Right.
So just take digitalization. I mean, almost by default, the pandemic has taught us the centrality of what digitalization will represent for our future capacity to respond. We have underinvested, we have underestimated its potential, but we also have risks. What happens next? there are so many people who are unable to access this digital universe today.
Half the planet.
Absolutely. And could we, for example, in the next few years, perfectly achievable, connect all these people? Because it's not just about being able to go back to school, for instance, or to be able to, trade on a platform. It's about people running their businesses, their livelihoods, governments being more effective. So we argue very strongly that the SDG push scenario is exactly where the world now needs to invest. Integrated approaches that don't try to just deal with one problem. The pandemic is a major drama, disaster, and tragedy. But it is linked to so many parts of our everyday decision-making in our economies, our societies, our daily lives. Our objective as a human family, as a family of nations, is to take our economy out of the way in the sense that it obstructs these transitions and align a financial system also to investing. As I said, we are the wealthiest generation in human history in financial terms, $418 trillion. 1.1% of that is needed in a sense to accelerate these transitions, and we're also talking
just 1.1%.
Well, that's roughly the estimate, and it's an upgraded investment estimate from by the OECD. But let me also be clear: it's not about filling financing gaps only. If the 400 trillion that are currently often invested in doing things that are harming our planet, exacerbating or increasing inequality, could be redirected, then public policy and fiscal space is exactly what it should be: a catalyst, a trigger, a direction setter, and the economy is actually driving this transition. At the moment, we have the challenge that public policy is telling us to go in one direction. Financial markets, the economy, investors are still investing in yesterday's economy. This is a recipe for failure on pandemic resilience, on climate change, on economic recovery.
Well, I'll tell you, you've come to the right place, because later on in this program, we have a moderated debate on narrowing and closing the digital divide. Vera Songwe, let me bring you back in. What are the investment areas with the biggest potential for development gains in Africa through the recovery and the remainder of this decade?
Thank you again. I think just building up on what Akim said, we've done a series of studies for 10 African countries, essentially writing off the African Union's green recovery strategy, looking at what does a green recovery look like in these countries and where are the sectors where we can see potential for growth. Of course, we see potential for growth in the energy sector, not just growth, but job creation. We see potential for growth in the agriculture sector. Interestingly enough, a lot of potential for growth. Some of the countries we studied were Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, and the Democratic Republic. In Kenya, 120% higher returns on jobs and 200% higher return on value addition for green sectors, but particularly tourism. The same kinds of results show up also in Egypt, where you can have more green tourism, 50% more return on jobs. In South Africa, 250% more return on jobs if they transition to green economy recovery. I think when we talk about that, then people say, what are you talking about? We're talking about more sustainable energy, but I hasten to say that in Africa, we still need gas as a transition supply. But we've seen that tourism in many of our countries is now becoming a different kind of tourism. It's a tourism of the environment. People want to go to the Okahonga Valley. People want to go and see the pyramids. So it's a different tourism. It's not just beaches. And I think that the conservation that comes with that creates jobs. But Akim, yes, don't hesitate. It's built forward better. We believe we're not going backwards. It has to be forward. And we believe that there's also nature-based solutions, which is essentially, today 23 million women across the world die from poor respiratory diseases because they're using trees to cook. We can change that. And by doing that and creating improved cooking stoves, you save time, you create more income because you generate business, and you save health, going back to the health conversation. So again, I totally agree with Akim and UNDP and ourselves are doing some work that shows that, these integrated solutions are really the way to go. But they must be integrated and looking at the sustainable green recovery going forward, which is where the African Union Green Recovery Strategy is anchored.
In preparation for this moderation, I scribbled a few notes, and I said COVID-19 highlighted old fault lines, the world facing a volatile moment, vaccinated versus unvaccinated, rich versus poor. Often it's a white versus black scenario, unemployed versus the employed, powerful versus weak, national interest versus the global collective good. In a sense, history repeating itself here. Having painted that scenario, what is your message to world leaders? Akim, you first, and what do you want them to take away from this conversation?
Well, I was listening to BTS earlier on and what they got out of asking their fans. And I think this, if you listen to young people, there is a lot of room for being frustrated, cynical, etc. but the welcome generation is what we're looking at, and that's our opportunity. So embrace the goals as a plan that we have agreed amongst us, despite all our differences. If the world doesn't come together, if we don't find together between young and old, rich and poor, then truly the future will be bleak. But that's not where we're heading, and that's why the SDGs are such a great compass.
Fiera, final word to you, 20 seconds, please.
20 seconds, I say right now we're in a world of dynamic divergence, just like you have seen. We're growing apart, we need to reconverge. Convergence is the only way to achieving the SDGs and to really getting to prosperity, because what everybody wants, young, old, developed and developing countries, is prosperity. And so I think looking at this in a way that takes us away from this divergence we've seen in vaccines, divergence on debt, divergence on the response to climate change, we need to come back, we need to converge, and only a better and stronger multilateral system centered around the United Nations can deliver that.
Fiera Songwe, Akim Steiner, thank you to you both for your insights and for speaking with us today. Juju, it's back to you in the General Assembly Hall.
Thanks to you, Sherwin, and to our esteemed panelists, and informative ones at that. Welcome back to the General Assembly Hall for the beginning of our next segment on plan, pathways, and partners for the recovery and beyond. We'll now hear from three esteemed guests who are here in person today. His Excellency, Mr. Colin Vixen Kelapile, is the President of the Economic and Social Council, the UN's home for overseeing SDG progress and the work of the UN development system across the world. Welcome, Mr. President.
Excellencies, heads of state and government, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I am indeed honored for this opportunity to speak at this auspicious event on the 2021 SDG Moment. The SDG Moment provides a unique opportunity to renew our commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It also gives us a real moment to reaffirm our political resolve to take decisive action to accelerate the realization of the 17 sustainable goals in the decade of action. This high-level event is convened at a time when we are facing unprecedented challenges and setbacks in a time span of less than a decade to our destination of 2030. As the Secretary-General has observed in his report on our common agenda, humanity faces a stark and urgent choice: a breakdown or a breakthrough. For us to achieve a breakthrough, we need to embrace transformational change and launch bold collective actions that will spur us forward in our development path. The path is in no doubt a steep one, especially due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. But this is despite miraculously speedy achievements in vaccines development, which gave the world some hope that we can indeed eradicate the pandemic at similar speed. You will all agree that the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic is far from over. As you already know, the majority of our countries, especially those in the Global South, lack access to COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Furthermore, the crisis has resulted in regression in the progress we had made towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals thereby worsening many other pre-existing ills that include inequalities and poverty. Excellencies, before we were confronted by the COVID-19 pandemic, we already and continue to grapple with other global challenges, such as the climate change crisis and biodiversity loss. The COVID-19 pandemic has in fact compounded these challenges that we have been working steadfastly to resolve in order to get back on track to realizing our development agenda. I therefore share the view that it is only through unprecedented global cooperation and solidarity that we can recover sustainably from the pandemic and the other challenges that we are facing to get back on track to achieve the SDGs. We will only be able to lift the entire world out of inequality and disease if we pursue the SDGs as part and parcel of policies and programs to address the pandemic and its multifaceted impacts. Excellencies, the voluntary national reviews conducted by 42 countries at the 2021 High-Level Political Forum for Sustainable Development, conducted under the auspices of ECOSOC, has demonstrated that several countries, including middle and low-income countries, are already applying the lessons gained from the crisis to initiate or accelerate structural changes we need to achieve the SDGs. Many have designed their own social protection plans to address the financial hardship from COVID-19. Some countries have used emergency health or social protection measures as a springboard to ensure universal health coverage and stronger and inclusive social protection systems. I therefore wish to take this opportunity to encourage those countries that have not yet presented their voluntary national reviews to consider doing so. And I also invite those that have already done so to do it again, as VNRs allow for deeper reflection on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Excellencies, our theme for ECOSOC and the 2022 High-Level Political Forum is building back better from COVID-19 while advancing the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda. This theme was developed with the view to channel our efforts in the coming months towards swift recovery from COVID-19, moving towards realizing the SDGs. I therefore look forward to working closely with all the member states as we engage in the 2022 HLPF voluntary national reviews, and I wish to underscore here that the VNRs are indeed an important mechanism for peer learning, including on achieving SDG-guided recovery. The Council will also continue to contribute on policy guidance to promote well-targeted financing for SDGs. It will drive innovation, science and technology as a means to build resilience and overcome pressing challenges. I am already working with the President of the General Assembly so that our common charter bodies can jointly push for delivering on their commitments on climate change, building also on the forthcoming Glasgow COP26 conference and the 2030 Agenda. During my presidency, ECOSOC and the HLPF will work in an inclusive manner, listening particularly to the world's youth, the poorest and vulnerable people, involving women and girls and civil society organizations, as well as promoting effective multi-stakeholder partnerships with the private sector for SDGs achievement. Excellencies, as I conclude, I wish to stress once more the importance to build on our best past achievements, while we also adopt new transformative and creative actions to move forward, united in our collective ambition for a world where no one is left behind. I will continue to use ECOSOC and the HLPF to mobilize the critically needed political will, innovation, and decisive action to accelerate the achievement of the 2030 Agenda. The Council remains at your disposal to contribute in addressing the current and emerging challenges. And I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Mr. President, thank you so much for your remarks. Up next, we have the honor of welcoming His Excellency, Mr. Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, President of Ghana, and a co-chair of the Secretary-General's SDG Advocates. Mr. President.
UN Deputy Secretary-General, Excellency Amina Mohammed, the Prime Minister Erna Solberg of Norway, co-chair of the SDG Advocates, fellow SDG Advocates. In September 2019, world leaders of the SDG Summit in New York unanimously declared the years 2020 to 2030 as the decade of action and called on all member states to step up and scale up significantly actions to give our world a fighting chance of achieving the global goals by the end date of 2030. Sadly, a few months after this historic declaration, our world was hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has since had a devastating effect on lives and livelihoods and significantly undermined prospects of achieving the SDGs. Available estimates indicate that in 2020 alone, some 124 million people in the world were pushed back into extreme poverty, with some 132 million people experiencing hunger as a result of the pandemic. The net effect of these adverse developments is that our world is unlikely to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger by 2030. The quest to achieve the SDGs has indeed become more daunting, but this cannot and should not deflate our efforts. Rather, this is the time to think big, and act smartly. As countries take action to address the effects of the pandemic, we cannot afford to perpetuate unsustainable development by disturbing the critical balance between economic, social, and environmental imperatives. Amid the ongoing detrimental effects of the pandemic, I hold the strong view that the SDGs remain even more relevant today than ever. Our recovery measures and interventions cannot and should not be delinked from actions to ensure prosperity, promote peace, protect people, and safeguard the planet. Undeniably, the SDGs provide a sound framework for responding to the pandemic and putting communities, businesses, and ecosystems on a sustainable pathway. Excellency, I want to emphasize two essential ingredients for the task of building forward better and scaling up actions to hasten progress towards the realization of the SDGs. First, there's a pressing need to bridge the $2.5 trillion United States SDGs financing gap, especially for developing countries, where the human development deficit is indeed greatest. With an estimated 400 trillion United States dollars available in global financial assets as of 2019, the resources to finance the SDGs are certainly available. The question raised is whether the rich countries of the world are thus prepared to accept the new paradigm of the SDGs and play their part or not. Secondly, the ability to access and deploy innovative solutions and new technologies will greatly speed up progress towards the goals. New forms of social practice and organization, as well as new and improved technological products and processes, are key enablers for achieving the SDGs. Whilst embracing innovation, deliberate steps should be taken to discourage innovations that contribute to environmental degradation, that are disruptive of livelihoods, and that exacerbate inequalities. As our world strives to drive with the challenges posed by the pandemic, we have to turn the crisis into an opportunity and ramp up actions necessary to achieve the SDGs. We should accelerate and deepen our efforts during this decade of action to build a fairer, healthier, safer, and more prosperous world for all. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have the honor now of hearing from your fellow chair of the Secretary-General's SDG Advocates, Her Excellency, Ms. Erna Solberg, Prime Minister of Norway. Welcome, Madam Prime Minister.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are contending with three crises at once: a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a climate crisis. Transformative change is needed both at home and abroad. And we know the path we need to take, and we have a plan. The 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals are the roadmap to the world we want. And we must mobilize political will to implement it. We must do more in partnership as governments, private sector, academia, and civil society. And we must work together at the multilateral level. We need equitable and fair distribution of vaccines. We need good health systems, social protection, and quality education. And we must fulfill our obligations under the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. We must secure financing for development, and we need coordinated action on debt relief. We need sustainable investments and jobs. We must raise our ambition level ahead of COP26. And together, we will work to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, in line with the goal of the Paris Agreement. The UN Food Systems Summit will take place in a few days. We need to see clear political commitments to improve food systems and to end hunger. And we all know development is not just about the money. We must govern better to address the pandemic, respond to crisis, and ensure recovery. We need to combat corruption and tax evasion. We can and must strengthen accountability, transparency, integrity, and inclusion for sustainable development. And we must secure the future welfare system of a rapid growing population. This will require job creation and economic growth. Human rights, equality, and non-discrimination must be at the core of our efforts. Norway is hosting a digital global disability summit in February. The aim is to secure concrete political commitments to accelerate lasting inclusive development. Norway presented its second voluntary national review at the high-level political forum this year. Norway scores high, but also we have challenges to overcome. This will require political will, both at home and abroad. All of us share a common future and common challenges. This is why I welcome the vision presented by Secretary-General Guterres in our common agenda. We must work together to respond to crisis effectively, and we must act together to reach the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And we must act now. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Prime Minister. And that brings an end to today's proceedings here at the UN General Assembly Hall. I want to thank our distinguished speakers. Let's turn our attention now to hear from our first group of world leaders, heads of state and government from the Africa region. We will hear momentarily from the presidents of the Arab Republic of Egypt, the Republic of Kenya, the Republic of Malawi, and the Republic of Mozambique. But first, let's take a look at some future scenarios work from the UN Development Program, analysis that demonstrates the potential for significant SDG progress across the continent between now and 2030.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السيد أنطونيو غوتيريش.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, Secretary-General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, it's a pleasure to speak to you today at today's meeting, which is coming at a crucial time for the world, thus confirming the importance that our states attach to development efforts, particularly the Sustainable Development Goals, which the international community has adopted as a general framework within which we are to realize the prosperity and the well-being of our peoples throughout this decade and up until 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, our success in achieving the SDGs today is more important than ever, particularly in these critical international circumstances, which mean that we have to face extremely difficult global challenges to which the COVID-19 pandemic has added unforeseen dimensions that have affected all states. In addition to sustainable development, we need to increase growth and eliminate poverty and unemployment. But we also have the complex political situation in very many areas of the world. We also have climate change and its devastating impact on access to water and food security. The threat posed by the pandemic on the health and social situation throughout the world. All of these are challenges that we have to face on a daily basis. and which we have to address in a comprehensive and sustainable way in order to keep the achievements that we have been able to achieve over the last decades. Here I would like to confirm a number of important things. Firstly, the events that the world has experienced over the last 2 decades have proven the inevitability of the need for the 2030 agenda that must take into account the interaction between the economic and social spheres that are addressed by these goals. And we must try to benefit as much as possible from the opportunities offered to us by the SDGs in terms of international cooperation for funding of development, or in multilateral frameworks, or in terms of bilateral relations with development partners, be that financial institutions, states, or international banks, whilst respecting the priorities of states and national ownership of policies and development programs. Secondly, given their importance, from the beginning, Egypt has wanted to take ownership of the SDGs and incorporate them into our development programs and policies at all levels. This effort has led us to adopt Egypt's 2030 vision. As part of the efforts deployed by the government in this area, we also have presented our voluntary report with regard to the implementation of the SDGs. The last of these was the third VNR that was presented by Egypt at the last high-level forum in July 2021. We are persuaded of the importance of reviewing the progress that has been made at national level, particularly with regard to the creation of an environment that is appropriate for development at the national level. Also, it's important to examine the positive developments of economic and social reform programs in order to have an exchange of experiences in this area. Thirdly, from the beginning, Egypt recognizes that all efforts deployed by the state to bring about development must be focused on the citizen. And that being the case, we have designed our development programs and policies to take into account first and foremost the interests of the Egyptian citizen and to respond to their aspirations for a dignified life, decent housing and employment. This vision was crystallized into a program called Dignified Life. This is one of the most ambitious and comprehensive programs that we have. It is to bring about global development, including in rural areas of Egypt, where the majority of the Egyptian population live, in order to strengthen the efforts of the state in the area of balanced regional development and to mobilize necessary investment to improve the quality of life for citizens, eliminate poverty, and reduce the level of unemployment. Fourthly, the success that Egypt has seen over recent years in these areas was not without sacrifice on the part of Egyptian citizens. Through that sacrifice, they have shown that they are able to endure difficulties in order to build the country and realize their legitimate aspirations. Egypt resolutely and despite all challenges is proceeding with the implementation of our ambitious economic reform program that we began in 2016 in cooperation with the International Monetary Fund. And the results of this to date have proven the correctness and the clairvoyance of our approach and the need for economic reform. These results have been largely applauded at the international level by international financial institutions as well as by other rating agencies. This has made it possible for the Egyptian economy to address the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic and has meant that the government has been able to take necessary measures to alleviate the negative impacts of the pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, I am sure that our deliberations today, the ideas and the proposals, constructive proposals that we are going to produce will help to strengthen the activities of our states in the implementation of the SDGs and help us find innovative solutions to the obstacles standing in the way of international cooperation, particularly the drop in public development aid that developing countries are facing, particularly African countries. In that context, we hope to see a continuance of this important international effort so that we can achieve our common goals and create a better future for future generations. Thank you.
Antonio Guterres, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you, Secretary General, for convening this second SDG Summit. It provides us with much needed opportunity to give impetus to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The pandemic has stalled and in some cases even reversed the tremendous gains on achieving the SDGs. I want today to reaffirm Kenya's commitment to the SDGs and to ensuring that we maintain the implementation momentum that we started with. Kenya developed a country SDG roadmap in the year 2016, which was then integrated with our national development agenda through our medium-term plan. Additionally, my administration has sharpened the economic policy by prioritizing action in sectors with the greatest multiplier effect on the economy, these being namely affordable housing, manufacturing, universal health coverage, and food security and nutrition. These actions are intended to accelerate SDGs 2, 3, 8, and 11, and underpin progress on the rest of the goals that we have set. We have made excellent progress on some of the SDGs, in particular on education, gender, and climate change. On other SDGs, it remains work in progress. Under SDG 2, which aims to end hunger and achieve food security, we face headwinds because of the vagrancies of weather triggered by climate change. Kenya has undertaken measures to promote sustainable cities and human settlements and undertaken major housing and infrastructure upgrades to reduce the expansion of informal settlements as well as urban slums. On climate change, we have taken measures to promote sustainable use of the terrestrial ecosystem and embarked on a afforestation program to increase our forest cover to 10% of our total landmass by the year 2022. And I am glad to say that we are on track. My administration has undertaken 2 voluntary national reporting assessments for the SDGs. We have found that priorities of my administration adequately cover the SDG targets, and with greater international solidarity, we will build back better, build back stronger, and regain the momentum on achieving the SDGs. I thank you.
Your Excellency, Mr. Abdallah Al-Shahid, President of the 76th session of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary-General, Excellencies, heads of state and government, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, Excellencies, Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, in the decade of action can only be achieved through collaboration. Nothing has made this fact more self-evident than COVID-19, which has rolled back years of progress on SDGs and demands collective action towards recovery. For Malawi, the SDGs most adversely affected by this pandemic or lagging are 1, 5, 7, and 8. For this reason, as a government, we have developed a 10-year implementation plan to get back on track with these and all SDGs by 2030. Central to this is addressing extreme poverty, SDG 1, by continuing to protect the most vulnerable households through our Social Cash Transfer Program, SCTP, which is already helping over 290,000 households and will benefit from improved targeting solutions like Novisi. Ending the dehumanizing levels of poverty in our country is more than a goal for us. It is a matter of urgency. That is why our implementation plan includes initiatives to fast-track progress on SDGs that advance our march against poverty. Our key example is SDG 5, to achieve gender equality and women empowerment. Because a society that disempowers women keeps millions poor. I'm confident that this level of focus will only expedite the great progress we are making on SDGs 2, 3, 4, 9, and 13. On SDG 2, for example, which aims to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture, government initiatives like the Affordable Inputs Program, AIP, have increased food production by 21%, removing hunger from the poverty equation. On SDG 9, which aims to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation, multiple road infrastructure projects are in progress. The proportion of manufacturing in our GDP has also gone up by 3%, no doubt spurred by stable energy supply and investments in telecommunications that have raised the uptake of 4G mobile from 15.6% in 2016 to 65% in 2020. The biggest lesson from all of this is that SDGs complement each other, and so we must implement interventions that have multiplier effect on the attainment of all SDGs. This, in turn, demands collaboration, collaboration, and corroboration. Thank you for listening.
Your Excellency, Mr. President of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished peers, heads of state and government, in September 2015, we deliberated on a global action plan for sustainable development for the next 15 years. We have strategically identified 17 goals and committed to a systematic follow-up and evaluation of its implementation until 2030. Our country has aligned national planning and budgeting instruments with the Sustainable Development Goals, established a national team and adopted the National Indicators Framework, and developed a report of the National Voluntary Assessment in 2020. We intend to rid the country from poverty, inequalities, and make it resilient to climate change and free from terrorism and the negative impact of COVID-19. Ladies and gentlemen, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic is visible in Mozambique in the rise of the number of infections, fatalities, as well as the national economy slowdown. In order to reverse this picture, the government of Mozambique has developed the National Preparedness and Response Plan and took restrictive and mitigation measures of the impact of the outbreak. The following are worth highlighting. Temporary waiver of value-added tax in essential products, reduction of power and water for the social tariff service users, relaxation of credit restructuring conditions, and expansion of beneficiaries of social protection programs. We committed to implementing concrete programs to meet the goals, and worth highlighting are the following. SDG 2, Zero Hunger, through Sustenta program, which is aimed at building capacity of small farmers by providing them with inputs and implements towards zero hunger. SDG 3, Good Health and Well-being. We are expanding health facilities through the implementation of One District, One Hospital program. SDG 4, Quality Education. We have built capacity for the use of distance learning, tele-school and radio school, and increased the use of information and communication technologies. SDG 6, Clean Water and Sanitation. We have fast-tracked and expanded water supply to the communities under the National Program of Water for Life. SDG 8, Decent Work and Economic Growth. We have promoted more investment, incentives to entrepreneurship and skills development for self-employment, particularly among the youth and women. SDG 14, Life Below Water, and SDG 15, Life on Land. We have acted in the preservation and restoration of ecosystems, among other interventions. Ladies and gentlemen, despite the challenges and uncertainties arising from the pandemic and limitation of financial resources, Mozambique reiterates its unequivocal commitment to fully implement the Sustainable Development Goals and invites all to work together towards the future we want. Thank you very much.
Thank the heads of state and government for their contributions. Next, we will hear now from a second group of African leaders. We begin with a live contribution from the President of Sierra Leone, Mr. President Julius Maada Bio. You have the floor, sir. Welcome.
General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I thank the Secretary General for convening this second SDG moment to highlight inspiring SDG actions despite continuing COVID-19 pandemic. The unprecedented challenges of COVID-19 have further exposed nations to heightened vulnerabilities and to rethink delivery on SDGs. Mr. Secretary General, Sierra Leone's medium-term National Development Plan is our nationally owned roadmap for building a society that is cohesive, secure, and just. It is aligned with the African Union Agenda 2063 and the global SDGs. It prioritizes human capital development, and we have identified SDG 4, quality education, and SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, as our accelerator goals. Those goals remain pivotal to the transformation of our country, and my government remains fully committed to their implementation. Our commitment to deliver on SDG 4 is demonstrated in the increased budgetary allocations to education, free and inclusive access to quality education in line with our policy on radical inclusion, policy reforms, and infrastructure and other developments to support education. In spite of COVID-19, school enrollments have increased. There are higher student success and comprehensive safety indicators. Families are saving in excess of $500 a year per student, and completion and retention rates are also up. On SDG 16, my government is operationalizing the Independent Commission for Peace and National Cohesion. There is expanded nationwide access to justice, and the Legal Board Aid continues to provide free legal representation to unserved Sierra Leoneans with a 93% increase in service rate from 2018. Government is working with civil society actors. We have repealed the seditious libel laws and abolished the death penalty. In spite of COVID-19 challenges, my government will continue its work on strengthening governance, deepening the decentralization, and streamlining domestic resource mobilization through our integrated national finance framework. We are using science, technology, and innovation to simplify governance, financial management, and procurement systems. Mr. Secretary General, let me conclude by reiterating the call for partnerships and cooperation to deliver on SDGs in order to achieve the future we want and to ensure that no one is left behind. Thank you.
We thank the President of Sierra Leone for his intervention, and we now proceed to pre-recorded statements from the Presidents of Zambia and Zimbabwe. Take a look.
I wish to start by commending you for successfully convening this session on the SDG Moment.
I heard him rapping, so I was
this event is a clear testimony of the commitment that our countries attach towards full implementation of the goals and targets of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We live in a changing and dynamic global environment in which countries are interdependent and collaborate with each other in finding solutions to emerging challenges such as climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, terrorism, widening technological divide, and indeed illegal migration. Since the adoption of the SDGs in 2016, Zambia made its first voluntary national review in 2019 and presented some milestones. Progress towards meeting the goals of the 2030 Agenda has, however, not been without challenges. Notable is the coming in of the coronavirus pandemic that has compounded the pre-existing vulnerabilities, inequalities in all spheres of the economy. The pandemic disrupted agricultural production and trade, supply chains as well. Further, the healthcare system and the provision of education system was gravely disrupted, especially in parts of the country with inadequate ICT solutions. There is an urgent need to enhance Africa's capacity for innovation and development of ICT infrastructure to enable most developing countries, including our own, Zambia, to realize and enjoy the benefits arising from Industry 4.0. Zambia remains committed to accelerating the implementation of interventions towards attainment of the SDGs, while recognizing the need to enhance existing coordination, enhance efficiencies, improve targeting mechanisms, and efficient allocation of resources to deliver the desired results. It is therefore important that we leverage on our resources as a global community in order to enhance progress for achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I thank you.
President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid, Your Majesties, Excellencies, heads of state and government, Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary-General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, I applaud the convening of this second SDGs moment at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic continues to grossly impede the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. In the case of Zimbabwe, successive droughts, natural calamities, and over 2 decades of illegal economic sanctions imposed on our country by some Western powers have further hampered our progress. However, my country continues to chart policies, institutional reforms, and national priorities required for accelerated sustainable socio-economic development and growth. The pursuit to end poverty, create decent jobs, reduce inequalities, and to promote access to quality social services for all Zimbabweans remains on course. The advent of the COVID-19 pandemic saw my country introduce multi-pronged strategies to adapt to the new normal. These included an economic stimulus package that supported business and cushioned industry, especially women and youth-owned small and medium enterprises. Social protection coverage to vulnerable groups was broadened, while a free COVID-19 national vaccination program continues to be rolled out for all our citizens. Progress has been recorded across all the SDGs on key national aggregate indicators. Agricultural production and productivity is being encouraged, supported by improved land and water utilization. The adoption of climate-smart agricultural innovations and capacitation of smallholder farmers, input support schemes, among other interventionist policies, has seen an unprecedented jump in our total cereal production. This has resulted in increased throughput for agriculture value chain industries, as well as improved incomes. The participation of women and youth in the economy has subsequently widened, thereby addressing SDGs 1, 2, 5, and 8. Zimbabwe also reviewed its national micro, small, and medium enterprises policy towards transforming the sector into formalized, innovative, export-oriented, and competitive enterprises. With regards to SDG 3, Zimbabwe rolled out an innovative health financing policy and strategy and increased investments in public health infrastructure as well as skills development for our health service personnel. This has culminated in the reduction in maternal and under 5 mortalities, as well as a general decline in HIV prevalence. Strides are being made in the education sector, with focus now on innovation and competence-based education towards building a knowledge economy. Climate resilience and adaptation remain a key priority to ensure sustainable socio-economic development and a broad-based empowerment. My country is strengthening domestic resource mobilization as well as renewable energy initiatives. The capacitation of institutions that support democracy, good governance, and the rule of law is ongoing. Plugging illicit financial flows and ending corruption are also receiving due attention. Finally, Zimbabwe remains committed to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda in this, our decade of action and delivery. I thank you.
And we thank the distinguished heads of government and of state for their contributions. Before we hear from our next group of countries, let's zoom in on the first of 5 critical foundations for accelerating the SDG implementation that we will be looking at throughout our broadcast today. We begin with the conversation I held a few days ago on narrowing the digital divide. It is perhaps fitting that the conversation itself was not without its connectivity challenges, so we thank our participants for their understanding and for yours. Let's watch. Hello and welcome to the SDG Moment's conversation on narrowing the digital divide. I want you to think of this statistic. Half of the world's population has no regular access to the internet. Think about how your lives would be different if you were unable to Zoom with your loved ones or friends around the globe, or to join this very conversation. Connectivity has been described as SDG 0 because it is the enabler and accelerator for the entire 2030 agenda. Its impact can be felt across all aspects of society, including education and digital skills, income and gender equity, and economic growth. Ensuring connectivity for all by 2030 is entirely possible, but it requires cooperation between governments, civil society, technology companies, international partners, and many others, and it requires urgency. To answer these questions, we are joined by 3 experts. First, Paula Ingabire, the Minister of ICT and Innovation for Rwanda. Ms. Ingabire has led work in Rwanda to increase access to the internet and improve digital skills, helping Rwanda to achieve some of the highest connectivity levels among developing countries. Welcome. US-based venture capitalist investor Bill Tai has direct experience of delivering better internet access in several countries around the world. He is the founder of the nonprofit ActTai Global that supports environmental and economic empowerment via entrepreneurship. And finally, Doreen Bogdan-Martin, director of the ITU's Telecommunication Development Bureau. For more than a decade, she has served as executive director of the UN Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development and is leading ITU's collaboration with UNICEF on the GIGA project to connect all of the world's schools by 2030 as a catalyst for global connectivity. Welcome to all 3 my guests. Minister Ingabire, perhaps I can start with you. What role has the government of Rwanda played in getting more people online? Why do you think you have had such great success? Tell us.
Thank you for having me today. Very specifically, the role that the government of Rwanda has played really started on the onset of acknowledging that digital inclusion was so central to, one, our vision of becoming a knowledge-based economy, but also most importantly, it was central to all the efforts that we need to undertake as we transition into becoming a digital economy. And so those policies at the heart of them was, digital inclusion, ensuring access for all and not limiting it just to a select few. You did throw out a very glaring statistic around half of the population being unconnected. But when you look at that half of the population that remains unconnected today, more than 70% of that population is in Africa. And so even the gap that needs to be, to be addressed is even much bigger when you look at the developing world. Some of the things that the role that the government has done is, one, ensuring affordable infrastructure for all. And this really started on with the government investing in the backbone infrastructure, which then has been used as an anchor for the investment that the private sector has been able to put in place even today as we think about last mile connectivity. Secondly, it's also been one of the responsibilities or initiatives that we've undertaken as a government beyond the infrastructure is thinking about digitizing services and making sure that the deployment of these services is accessible for all, bearing in mind that there's still many people that live in areas of coverage, but still thinking about the infrastructure that is so central to ensuring that they can access these services and the information and opportunities that they need through this infrastructure. Third is at the heart of all this, empowering our citizens to be digital natives, as with basic digital skills that will really enable them to access this infrastructure, to use it to the benefit of their day-to-day lives. And lastly, obviously, it's been really thinking about access to devices. And I think this, multi-pronged approach to digital transformation is what has made this a successful model until today.
Bull Tide, to bring you in, talk a little bit about your work, the work you've been doing as a venture capitalist committed to narrowing the digital divide. Over to you.
Thank you. Obviously, it's education that is really what makes a difference in economic productivity. And if people are economically productive, a lot of good things can happen. And in the 90s, I happened to set up an ISP, and it ended up spreading to 10 countries throughout Southeast Asia. Ultimately, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Salomon Brothers took that company public, and we were powering millions of people through the data centers we had built throughout Southeast Asia. And what you could see happening was obviously access to the information that was typically, stuck in San Jose, allowed anybody connected to the internet anywhere in that region to be on equal footing. And so as we move forward now, it's so clear that to try to straighten out the inequities of this world in income distribution, you really need to start with education, and that starts with broadband. What we're doing today is fantastic to try to start that catalytic process of closing the digital divide.
Doreen Bogdan-Martin, it really is about getting everyone onto an equal footing, and if anything, COVID-19 has showed us just how important that is. Why have previous efforts to narrow this digital divide proved so difficult to achieve?
Well, it's great to be here. I was going to say, picking up on your comment, maybe because we didn't have a specific SDG. Lots of us tried to fight the case back in 2015 that we should have an SDG 18, or as you said, SDG 0. I think the result was they called it the invisible SDG, but perhaps it's the most important SDG as we've seen it. I think it's important to remember that this is not a new issue. Actually, back in the early 80s, Donald Maitland, he called it the missing link, but it was about fixed line telephony. And he made the case that getting access to a fixed line telephone was actually imperative to a country's economic and social development. Of course, fast forward many years, we have the internet and half the world not connected. I think the reason that previous efforts have failed is because it was always viewed as a nice to have, not an essential.
Right.
COVID made the case, right? It's the digital lifeline, and I think the urgency and the importance has never been clearer.
What are the practical barriers to providing affordable, sustainable digital access and skills, including in remote areas? I imagine money might be one of those.
It's both capital and technology. I think and the timing happens to be perfect right now. If you think about what it would have been like to light up all of these schools 20 years ago, it would have been extraordinarily expensive because you would have had to run fiber optic lines to different neighborhoods. You'd then have to connect the last mile, put all these terminals in place. And with the technology changes that are in front of us right now, all you need is a solar panel and a little bit of a wireless connection. If you think about what's happening with the economy today in certain areas, it's now all becoming digital. Look at all the people out there designing digital design And that's what they do. They're moving bits around on a screen. They're not having to dig holes in the ground and make all kinds of physical things. So I think it's a new world that we're entering right now, and now is the time to make this happen.
So you're saying that prohibitive costs are coming down, and yet we have this figure that half the world isn't connected. So what sort of trajectory do you see, given the fact that costs are coming down, and yet there's still a chasm that needs to be filled?
Yeah, there is a chasm, but I think it's really about getting the technology to a point where it is reasonable to deploy. I mean, whatever the cost that we're looking at now, if we had tried 15 to 20 years ago, it would have been 1,000 times that cost. And if it's billions, thousands of billions is quite a lot of capital. Now it's still a large amount, but you can do it also in very granular chunks. Part of building companies is setting up little nodes. You test them, make sure they work. And if one works, then you build out 3. If those 4 work, then you build out another 20. And then if those 20 work, you do 100. So we can enter this project with a handful of schools like the one in Rwanda, pick a few others, get them done for, a very small amount of money. Prototype, test, build out the digital fabric, allow the kids to have digital wallets so they are not just connected to the broadband connection, but connected economically and connected through content in education. And once you get a couple of those nodes working, then it's really easy to just replicate and scale.
I'll tell you, Bill, Doreen Bogdan-Martin continues to nod when you speak, so I think you're making sense and she agrees with what you're saying. How can innovation, Doreen, help make connectivity available to everyone, including people in poorer or hard-to-reach areas, right? We talk about prohibitive costs. They become more prohibitive when you talk about rural areas, people living in the mountains, people living far from big cities. So just what sort of challenge does that present to us?
Well, I was nodding because indeed Bill mentioned many of those innovative approaches that we need to be focusing on. I think we need innovation in financing, in regulatory and policy approaches, in our use of new technologies, and we need sort of innovative partnerships like GIGA. You mentioned GIGA. Where we're looking at how can we put together this connectivity bond. So how can we really look at new kinds of financing to get the connectivity there? It's 3.7 billion people, as we've said. It's 428 billion that we're looking at just in the infrastructure piece. On top of that, it's the digital skills and the content and all those other pieces. So it's a big investment, but I believe it can be done, and absolutely through these innovative approaches.
I'll stay with you just for a second. In my introduction, I talked about how GIGA is going to connect, or seeking to connect the world's schools by 2030. When we look at progress on all the SDGs, countries around the world are lagging. There's no real exception. Do you see that coming to fruition, given the time span we have left before 2030 to get all schools around the world connected? Help us here.
So we have 19 on board so far, few more to go. I believe that we can do it. As I said, we're taking an innovative approach modeled around how Gavi was constructed. So with the Gavi model, it was about vaccines and aggregating demand, and we believe we can use a similar model for aggregating demand for connectivity. So we're in the process of trying to put together this $5 billion donor-backed bond. We need, of course, the MDBs, the IFIs, the donor agencies. We really need all partners to come together. And in doing so, we need to map the schools of the world. Believe it or not, many countries don't know where their schools are. They certainly don't know which schools are connected. So those two pieces are critical as we try to advance in the GIGA model. Then comes the new technologies piece that Bill also referred to. And then, of course, what happens when you get connected, those digital public goods and those tools that you need to be empowered.
Some say, show me the money. Some say, where is the money going to come from, Bill? How can countries successfully finance connectivity through public-private partnerships?
Sure. If you think about past ways of infrastructure, I think it's going to look very similar. When I was first introduced to the GIGA project, what struck me was it reminded me of the build-out of the railway system and the economies that developed every place that the railway stopped. So if you think about laying the tracks, every time there was a little stop, a little town formed, that town became the hub of an economy, and you added a ton of value to the GDP because you wouldn't have had a town there, right? So if you think about today, what was fixed line communications is now a wireless link. And when you attach that to a school and you attach the kids and the people around that school digitally, you are forming new economies at every point, right? And it's become so much easier and so much cheaper. I'll bet that if you took the dollar cost of all of the railways and highways and bridges and things that got put in, 100 years ago, and you adjusted them for inflation, I don't know the number, but I'll bet it's bigger than the number that we need to do now. And as we go forward, the costs are going to go down at the margin. So as you go into volume on these wireless links and the digital fabric starts to expand, the marginal cost of adding users in schools will shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink. And the level of economy that is organized around those nodes is going to go up a lot. So I think it's something that this world needs to do and can do. And every year that goes by, it becomes easier to do. So I think there's going to be a layer that's sort of like the infrastructure financing of the past. And then as you start to get activity in those nodes, there's a lot of private capital that's going to want to run over there to fund those towns, fund those little GDP balls sticking on top of the ends of those nodes.
Doreen, let me bring you back. And when we talk about public-private partnerships, there's always a conversation about who leads. Does the public sector lead in that partnership, or does the private sector lead? When we talk about narrowing the digital divide, what's your sense of who should be in the lead here? Should this be driven by the private sector, and what role does government have to play?
It needs to be both, and I would say actually, and more. I think it needs to be the international organizations, the UN, its sister agencies. We need governments, the private sector, civil society. We really need, I like to say, we need all hands on deck, and I think that's what it's going to take to get it done. I do think we have a sort of good roadmap in front of us. We have the SDGs Digital Cooperation Roadmap. We have the Common Agenda, where the SG talks about this breakdown or breakthrough moment for the world. And I really think that with digital, this can be the breakthrough moment. We just need to focus. We need that sort of laser focus. Let's focus on connectivity. We know the impact it can make, and let's focus on connecting schools. It will be life-changing for the world.
A question to both of you just before we wrap. Nothing is ever a straight line. As much as great policy and great ideas on paper, lots of obstacles can show themselves. Corruption, for example, climate change, for example, that can disrupt connectivity and that sort of thing. We're really in a very important moment here where all the SDGs really need to come together so that this can become a success. I'm going to give you both the final word. Bill, first to you.
Sure. I think the world is confronted with so many problems, and when I think about the financial picture in front of us, you've got, roughly 7 billion people on the planet, 2 billion in developed nations, and 5 billion in undeveloped nations. And you think of the world GDP at 70 trillion roughly, and debt load of 270 trillion. The 70 trillion is growing a couple percent a year. The debt load's growing 10% a year. Those lines will not ever intersect the way things are, which obviously points to a systemic collapse, among other things. The only solution that I see out of this problem is to take that other 5 billion people and step it up where they can contribute productively to the economy, and you grow that little GDP ball of 70 a little bit faster. If that happens, then you eliminate a lot of the other stuff, the climate change issues. If people are working in a new digital world, moving ones and zeros around on a screen, not digging holes in the ground to find coal to burn it, it's a different world. And I think, you solve a lot of the hunger issues. You'll help the, stave the extinction of animals. It's just the root of everything we need to do.
Doreen, this is a game-changing moment, is it not?
Indeed, it is. It is. And I really think connectivity, it's the thread that ties all the SDGs together. I think it's our only hope to get those SDGs back on track. And we need to approach it, let's say, holistically. I think that governments need to view digital and connectivity issues not as a single silo, but as something that can impact their whole economic development structure. I think we should aim to achieve universal, affordable, accessible, trusted, I would add, because we need to remember that important element of trust and safety. And I think we can do this by 2030. I think we have to do this by 2030. And in doing so, I believe that we can unleash incredible human potential and bring opportunities, life-changing opportunities to all.
Thank you to all my guests for an invigorating discussion. We wish you well and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
And yet another eye-opening conversation with Sherwin. That was another eye-opening conversation with Sher. Thanks to Sherwin. And we're going to return now to UN member states and their contributions. We're being asked to wait as we reboot the computer, as we know, with issues of connectivity and beyond. We often have technical difficulties, so this is one of those moments. Clearly, the role of connectivity in sustainable development is one that is a thread throughout today's conversation, as is the intergenerational conversations that inspire the vision of youth in working towards these SDG goals into the future. This is an important turning point in our time, and as we combat these crises of climate and the pandemic and beyond, it's clearly a time to reinvigorate the youth and get them involved in what we're putting our shoulder to the wheel for. And as we prepare to hear from more members of state, I'll give you a preview of what we have later on, a conversation with Ms. Ingar Anderson and Ms. Mari Pangetstu of the World Bank. And we're going to be talking about other opportunities for sustainable development and working together. We'll also hear more from various partners and stakeholders in development. Clearly, this is a moment where we're bringing the international community together to engage in important conversations on these topics. And we are, at this moment, getting prepared to reconvene our Sustainable Development Goals moment. So stand by, stay with us as we continue this conversation. I'm grateful to have heard from other leaders of throughout the world this morning in our session. And now we're going to turn back to more leaders and heads of state and their contributions. We're going to look at scenarios for SDG progress in Asia and the Pacific region before we hear from the President of the Republic of the Marshall Islands and the Prime Minister of Japan and the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Thailand.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary-General, Excellencies, Yahweh from the Marshall Islands, and let me begin by expressing the Marshall Islands' appreciation of the convening of this important event. We find this a well-timed opportunity to express our commitment to the continued implementation of Agenda 2030. As a small island state, our country faces unique challenges, including geographic isolation, rising sea levels, and climate change impact, among others. To mitigate these challenges, we have developed a national strategic plan. We have integrated the Sustainable Development Goals into our national plan. In addition to our unique challenges, we have also faced the challenge of COVID-19. The RMI has successfully ensured the safety of our people from the pandemic and have supported our people and local businesses to ensure our economic and social fabric remains resilient. However, despite these efforts, COVID-19 continues to negatively impact our economy. We are committed to the health of our people. We praise the value of Kumit Ajimur, our health is a shared responsibility. The Kumit lifestyle is one where every Marshallese support one another in every effort to improve healthy lifestyles. Private sector inclusion remains a cornerstone of long-term sustainable economic growth. We continue to implement plans to increase employment opportunities and trade while minimizing social inequalities and environmental impacts. An inclusive One Nation concept aims to integrate the unique development needs of each RMI atoll. The NSP exemplifies how we address outer island development through this One Nation approach. Sea level rise combined with more frequent and severe periodic wave surges create tipping points for habitation in the RMI. Accelerated adaptation measures for well-being of atoll communities are being pursued with resources dedicated to support climate proofing and resilience building. Our Climate Change Directorate continues to work to implement the National Environmental Management Plan and integrate this with our National Adaptation Strategy. We are committed to fully implementing the NSP, which integrates the SDGs. We acknowledge that reaching the targets remain a challenge. This will require the collective efforts of all stakeholders, including those working on issues such as marine resource management and climate change, which depend on global leadership and action. Thank you, and kumol daga.
Your Excellency, Secretary General, Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, distinguished guests. The COVID-19 pandemic has been seriously impacting various areas of the Sustainable Development Goals. In order to achieve the SDGs by 2030, every country must develop creative strategies and work together to accelerate our efforts. As a country that attaches great importance to multilateralism, Japan is determined to lead the efforts of the international community to achieve the SDGs. With this in mind, Japan has submitted its second voluntary national review in 4 years, taking into account the valuable opinions of various organizations, associations, and civil society. The review sets out Japan's vision to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic. Based on this review, we will promote international cooperation and raise awareness in Japan. First, equitable access to vaccines and other tools is indispensable in the fight against this infectious disease. It is also critical to establish a more resilient global health system to prepare for future crises. To address these, Japan will continue its efforts to achieve universal health coverage globally based on the principle of human security and the belief of leaving no one's health behind. At the same time, to address climate change, promote digitalization, and realize gender equality, Japan will push forward social transformation that shapes the future by promoting and utilizing innovation in every field. The Sustainable Development Goals are an important compass to overcome unprecedented crises and lead the world to a better future. Before the end of this year, international conferences, which are closely related to the SDGs, are scheduled to be held, such as COP26, and the Tokyo Nutrition for Growth Summit 2021. Taking advantage of these meetings, Japan will do its utmost toward achieving the SDGs by 2030 and creating a hopeful future. Thank you.
His Excellency, the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, distinguished delegates, as a country that places importance on and have taken an active role in driving forward sustainable development at both the national and international levels, I am delighted to join the SDG Moment 2021 today, especially after Thailand presented our voluntary national review to the United Nations this July. The Thai government, in collaboration with all sectors, is systematically ensuring progress towards achieving the SDGs, guided by the sufficiency economy philosophy. The government has adopted the 20-year national strategy aligned with the SDGs to ensure that policy implementation and budgeting at all levels genuinely correspond with the country's development needs and SDGs implementation. In this decade of action for sustainable development, Thailand's pathway towards SDGs attainment involves 3 milestones. First is the promotion of quality of life and well-being for people of all ages. The COVID-19 pandemic has served to underline the importance of a robust public health system and inclusive universal health coverage. At the same time, adequate budget allocation for healthcare has become an immediate priority, in tandem with the upscaling of medical industries and public health services to ensure self-reliance during times of crisis for all Thai people, particularly the elderly, a group that is rapidly increasing in population. Second, in the building back of the Thai economy in the post-COVID-19 recovery phase through a balance of all things approach, Thailand is developing sustainable and environmental-friendly industries with the Bio-Circular Green Economy model, or BCG. The model is based on scientific and technological advancement and innovations aiming to, among others, add value to food and agricultural industries, build bio-industries and energy alternatives, and overhaul the tourism industry towards ecotourism. Furthermore, the automotive industry, for which Thailand is a significant global production base, will undergo structural adjustments. The government has set the goal of increasing the production of electric vehicles to 30% of total vehicle production by 2030 to meet Thailand's international environmental commitments and contribute to climate action. Third, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed existing vulnerabilities in the society, especially among those who lack access to digital technologies for learning and income generation. As a result, closing the digital divide and promoting digital literacy is key to unlocking the people's potential. The government will utilize the Thai People Map and Analytics Platform, or TP-MAP, based on the government's big data to respond to the need of specific groups and other poverty-related problems. Distinguished delegates, the SDGs cannot be achieved with the government's efforts alone. Rather, a paradigm shift and integrated action from all sectors, including the private sector and the people, are needed. In closing, I wish to affirm Thailand's commitment to move forward without leaving anyone behind, and our readiness to work in partnership with others to achieve the SDGs together.
We've just heard from, and of course throughout the morning we've heard from so many esteemed leaders, global leaders, and throughout. Joining me now for a conversation to reflect on what we've heard all morning from these world leaders is Ms. Mari Pangestu. She's the World Bank Managing Director of Development, Policy, and Partnerships. Thank you so much for joining us, Mari. If you can hear me, let me ask one concrete question, which is, if you could synthesize what you've heard from. We've heard from more than 10 heads of state and government this morning. What stands out to you, and what gives you reason for hope as you listen to their messages?
Thanks for that question. I was really inspired with what we've heard from leaders so far. We heard political will and leadership to address challenges ahead. As well, I think the recognition that it cannot be business as usual. I heard paradigm shift, I had integrated approach, and I heard partnerships, because that is what is needed. We are really facing this unprecedented development challenges accentuated by COVID and the climate crisis at the same time. So we do need an integrated solution because of the interrelationship between planet, people, and the economy. What gives me hope is the strong partnership and collaboration that we have seen emerge during the response and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, which needs to continue. The World Bank has been collaborating with UN agencies to deploy the largest program we've had in history, amounting to 157 billion since the start of the pandemic. And we financed hundreds of COVID-19 related projects in vaccine readiness and delivery, procurement of medical supplies, strengthening health systems, education, and social protection programs across the world. And many of these are implemented by UN agencies, including with partnerships at the local level. Another key partnership is the task force between the World Bank, WHO, WTO, and the IMF to address the urgency of ensuring equitable vaccine delivery and to accelerate the distribution of vaccines to developing countries. I think many of the leaders mentioned this. And we know that it's not just the right thing to do, but we all know that this is the key to ending the pandemic. So partnerships on this front and the financing that we have put on the table. We've also undertaken partnerships with the African Union, AFAD, and investments from IFC and other development agencies focus on ensuring that we have production for doses to be delivered to Africa. Moving forward, it will be key for all of us to work together for integrated solutions that will integrate climate with development. And I heard all the leaders mentioning this. And as part of our new climate change action plan, 35% of our financing will be to make sure that we have impact on both development and climate. And we are ready to work with countries and partners to implement this whole of government, whole of society, and whole of economy approach for integrated solutions for transformations in energy, food and land use, transportation, urban infrastructure, and manufacturing. And there will be a need for global support and collaboration because the urgency and the scale of action needed to achieve both SDG goals and climate action is really, really urgent for us to all work together, because the resources needed, the technologies that will be needed, and the collaboration that will be needed are so great. But I have hope that we are moving in the right direction on that front.
Ms. Mengistu, that's a very large set of agenda items that you are tackling, but you mentioned the climate crisis, and for that I want to bring in Ms. Ingar Anderson, who is the Executive Director of the UN Environment Program, and she can answer the same question, which is, after listening to 10 global leaders, heads of state and government this morning, what themes or concepts give you hope as you look down the horizon to the policy issues that you're dealing with? It looks as though we've lost the connection, so we will hope to be able to bring her back. Ms. Mengistu, let me turn back to you, if I may, in the interim, because this is clearly, as I said to you, an important list of agenda items in your inbox that you're tackling. When you think about what we heard this morning from the distinguished speakers, what do you think, on the flip side, we need to focus in on more, give a higher priority to, that perhaps you didn't hear from the podium?
I think there are many challenges that will greatly limit economic recovery, including debt, climate change, and human capital. And I think these are the issues that need to be addressed. Debt vulnerabilities have increased in recent years in emerging markets and low-income countries. And prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, debt was already at record highs in emerging and developing countries. So reduction in the stock of debt in the poorest countries is needed, as well as greater debt transparency and improved debt management, so that countries can encourage growth and promote favorable investment climates. In addition, I think a business as usual approach, or as one of the leaders used the word paradigm shift, which I totally agree with, is needed to recognize the interlinkages between climate change, COVID, worsening poverty, and structural weaknesses, which, if we don't address them in an integrated way, will lead to a lost decade of development. And in the bank, we have come up with an approach called Green, Resilient, and Inclusive Development, or GRID. It focuses on sustainability and focuses on integrating climate with development. So it's not just climate change or development, it's integrated. And this is needed, much needed, to restore the momentum to achieve the SDGs. And this is how we can create growth and jobs, address poverty and inequality, but also address climate mitigation and build resilience and adaptation. But it does require us to work with countries, and it does require, as many of the leaders mentioned today, will require global cooperation and collaboration and support from external sources, because fiscal space is constrained in many of these countries. We do need to come in with the financial resources and technologies that will be needed. And this is not just government or external public sources, but also the private sector. I think a big agenda will be how can we bring in and crowd in the private sector. And more than ever, countries will need to invest in all types of capital: physical, financial, human, and natural capital.
Ms. Bengetsu, thank you so much for your insights and your perspective. And we are nothing if not optimists here at the UN, so we're going to try again to engage in conversation with Ms. Ingar Anderson, who, as I said, is at the UN Environment Program. Ms. Anderson, the same question to you, which is, what ideas, concepts stood out to you among the world leaders as points of optimism?
So I don't know if you were asking me. I see myself now on the screen. Unfortunately, I can't hear. I heard Mary perfectly, but I can't hear the moderator. But assuming that the reason why you put me on the screen is because you want me to talk, I'll talk now. But listen, as we just heard from Mary and as we've heard from excellencies who have spoken, we are falling ever deeper into this global planetary crisis. And it is a crisis of climate change, but it is also a crisis of biodiversity and nature and a crisis of pollution. And it is on top of how we are going to have to try to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal. So when I say we, I really mean the entire global community needs to step up to resolve this, everyone, everywhere. That's the only way that we can solve this crisis. The Secretary-General has laid this out in the common agenda. And it's only by working together that we can really deliver this. Now, we understand that recovery spending that is being rolled out is not being rolled out in such a way that it is tackling these crises, or that it is or shifting the gear lever towards more sustainable future. So, but we can do this if we invest in clean energy and clean transport, if we invest in nature-based solutions, if we invest in circular economy and circular consumption and production, if we go after green research and development. And we can do all this, and that's exactly what we've heard from today. Minister and distinguished speaker making the undertaking that they will make these shifts. But it will only happen if we build it on solidarity. We saw yesterday the NDC report out by the UNFCCC, and they are not stretched as far as they need to be. If we deliver just what the NDCs that have been handed in would want, we would be at 7.2 degrees, and that is at the end of the century. And this is clearly not where we want to be. So therefore, but what we also understand is that the conditional elements of the NDCs would actually get us further. And that means, therefore, that climate finance, that the business sector, that the promises of Paris of the 100 billion per year need now to get delivered. We heard in the speeches that just concluded, for example, Abdullah Shahid, the president of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, speaking to the imperative of action, in particular, obviously, for the least developed countries and the small island states. And so the fact that this financing is being lined up by the MDBs, and we heard from the World Bank just now from Marie Pangesto, is good, but we need to see the bigger force of funding behind it. Because if we invest smartly, if we invest in the future, if we invest with solidarity, if we invest with equity and with sustainability in mind, then we actually can not only make the effort on climate, but certainly also on nature and pollution. And that will lead us to where we need to get to on the Sustainable Development Goals. So as we step into the negotiations in Glasgow, as we step into the negotiation in Kunming, this is what I urge every government to do, taking this opportunity. Now, I can't hear the moderator, so I will stop now, but if there are any questions, I'm afraid that I will not be able to answer them. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Anderson. I'm told that you can hear me. Can you hear me now? Can you not?
Now I can.
Excellent.
Now I can, which is miraculous. So thank
you. Wonderfully, you were able to give us a synopsis of this morning's discussions and speeches, but I wonder if you could give us a sense of what perhaps you didn't hear that you might have wanted more of an emphasis placed on in terms of policies moving forward.
You know, what we would like to hear are not the generalities. What we're looking for now as we're heading to Glasgow is the specifics. We have made promises for a long time. Look, here with UNEP, together with our friends at WMO, year after year for 30 years, IPCC has issued the annual reports, updates, etc. And the latest updates was, as the Secretary-General said, a code red for humanity. We are in this existential moment. So plans and promises, etc., are fine. But these plans begin today. And so what we're looking for are specifics that have got 2021, 2022 imprinted in them. And that we're still missing. We're also looking for firm commitments on financing, and that we're still missing in some quarters. And we're looking for the realization that it will take everyone, but also the realization that it is the G20 countries that hold the higher load here. 76% of all CO2 emissions are from the G20. So we are asking for the G20 to be very specific in their commitments. There can be no wobbling. And so that's kind of what we are asking for. We heard some of it, but we are looking forward to hearing more.
And Ms. Pangestu, if I can get you to comment on the G20 around the corner, what are you looking at as you see that convening, and yet reflect also on the UNGA, how in many ways this COVID convening of the UN General Assembly and the value of being able to have these high-level conversations among heads of state? I think we might...
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. Are you directing that question to me?
Yes, I was. Could you hear my question? Should I repeat it?
Yeah, I heard the last bit of your about UNG and G20.
And also the import of these convenings, both the UNGA.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that UNGA it's obvious that every one of them is bringing everybody together. And I think the moment there's a historical opportunity right now where, if you like, many of the alignments are there. But I think I agree with Inger that how specific do we want to go forward? What are the actions that we need to take? I think from the World Bank perspective, we are working with partners like the UN. That's why the UN GA is very important for us. And our president is there today. And our message is simply that we must have this integrated approach, which looks at development and the SDG goals as well as the climate goals. And you need to do it in an integrated way. It's neither or. And so how do we achieve that? We need to, first of all, work with countries to make sure that they have the long-term low-carbon development strategies where these plans come in, and the systems transformations that need to be made, whether it's energy, food and land use, or transportation, or urban infrastructure, or manufacturing. But they need to be supported. And this is where the G20, I think for the G20, the call that they themselves need to make, their commitments that they need to make. I understand not all the G20 countries have actually submitted their revised NDC plans. So I think a clear political commitment and signal from the G20 will be important. And also how the G20 will come together to support this much needed collaboration moving forward, to support the much needed and at-scale resources that will be needed, to invest in the transformations that will be needed in developing countries, whether it's energy. I think energy is one of the ones that is being talked about in the lead up to COP, because it is one of the big areas which has both development and climate in there. And how do you make sure that it's in energy access in the poorest countries and then energy transition in the middle income countries? So these are, I think, sort of the more specific discussions. And perhaps what is needed is some direction of travel in terms of the framework, and then how do we implement within that framework with some real concrete actions, as well as the resources and technologies that will be needed. Because a lot of the energy, for instance, the technologies are available, but they are still not accessible cost-wise, and also being able to access these technologies. How can we bring the cost of these technologies down so that they can actually be part of the solution? So these, I think, are some of the more concrete actions forward. And finally, I think, as I mentioned earlier, how do we bring the private sector along? And because a lot of the financing will have to come from the private sector, and the private sector is also shifting. They are also making commitments to go to net zero themselves as companies, as sectors. And there are all these standards issues and measurement of impact. If you're going to be investing in sustainable development outcomes, how do we measure this? And this is, again, I think, another area of work that is going on that we hope the World Bank is definitely a part of it, but it can only happen if we all collaborate on the same page.
Absolutely. These are vital partnerships. Thank you so much, Ms. Penketsu. One last question to you, Ms. Anderson. I saw you nodding throughout many of her remarks. Just curious, as you look at this existential moment, as you refer to, and this convening at UNGA, and again, also towards the G20, what do you look at as important initiatives?
Well, I think it's about finding where we're seeing forward movement, and we are seeing forward movement. And so amplify that. We're seeing forward movement in part of the banking sector, the private banking sector. People have signed up for net zero commitments. We have billions of dollars that have signed up under the net zero commitments. That is good. What we're calling for, however, is also that, and we're talking finance, that, central banks and the banking systems begin to understand the stress that climate is putting on it. And we've seen the conversation both from the IMF and from the World Bank about how, in fact, investing in stranded assets is no longer a safe thing, and we're seeing more and more institutional investors moving their resources towards longer-term sustainable investments, which in turn drives, obviously, better and closer alignment with the SDGs. That's very good. The government guardrails are sometimes missing. Setting and enabling the policies that will nudge and move the sector in that direction matters, because all of this will not come just from public finance to deliver the sustainable development goals. It'll have to take the private sector too. But that means that the subsidies that today are subsidizing hydrocarbon industry, the subsidies that today are subsidizing sustainable agriculture, the subsidies that are subsidizing highly polluting industries, well, they have to be looked at. And part of this, my on-ramp is environment, right, is to get these subsidies such that we can get to sustainability, because it's only with sustainable a long-term future in terms of our planet and its ability to sustain these 7 billion people today on this planet, that we will reach the Sustainable Development Goals. And right now, what we've seen with the NDCs yesterday is not where we want it to be. So the fact, and Mary mentioned that not all the large emitters have submitted their NDC, and I call and we call on all the emitters, or all the countries and parties to Paris to deliver by Glasgow or before, obviously, their NDC, and for that to be stretched. That was what we promised in Paris, that every 5 years we would review. Now is the time to step up. We are already at 1.2 degrees, and we see on our television screens before us and in our lives what it's doing. I can tell you, I'm sitting here in Kenya, and we are severely impacted with climatic variability and change, and we see it across the world. And so now is the time, because we have very little carbon budget left, and so we cannot continue on the path that we're on. And that is absolutely fundamental for us to solve, so that we can reach the Sustainable Development Goals. So heightening the conversation in UNGA, heightening the conversation in the upcoming World Bank annual meetings, and heightening the conversation and really creating a momentum so that when we do arrive in Glasgow and in Kunming for the COPs, we have an ability to get to stability, both climate-wise and nature-wise.
Well, I appreciate both of your intellects and expertise on this issue. Indeed, green development is sustainable development. Thank you both for joining us for this important conversation. And we're going to turn now to our next conversation on the pathways and partners. And my partner, Sherwin, will shortly lead a discussion on gender equality, which I love. Let's get started, though, with a film on the topic.
The pandemic has increased inequalities for women and girls in all areas of life. And yet, there's never been more momentum to overhaul the power dynamics of gender, demanding change, challenging norms, sharing power.
Education is the right of every child, and especially for girls, this right should not be neglected.
There's so much left to do, and soon is not soon enough to get the world's to-do list for gender equality done.
We must, if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, if we want to have a better world, we must have women and men in full equality.
Now is the time to get specific. Every global citizen owes it to every citizen on the globe to fight for more women in positions of power, an urgent end to violence against women and girls, sexual and reproductive health rights, quality education for all girls, women equal in law, equal pay, and economic empowerment.
Achieving gender equality for the Sustainable Development Goals is bringing the 50% of our population in the world into the picture. What we need to understand is a fundamental right for all human beings.
Let's get this done. Gender equality, everywhere, now.
You're watching the 2021 SDG Moment live from the United Nations headquarters here in New York. Gender equality is one of, if not the most important goals the UN has set for 2030, but the global pandemic has dealt a serious blow to progress in this area. Between 2019 and 2020, some women, to the total of 54 million, lost their jobs. This is closely tied to a caregiving crisis, yet as countries boosted social protection, only 11% of policies globally have addressed women's unpaid care work. COVID-19 has also sparked a shadow pandemic of violence against women worldwide, both online and offline. It is clear that without real progress on issues around gender equality, a meaningful, holistic recovery is not possible. As countries move gradually from response to recovery, they have a unique opportunity to unlock the kind of transformative change that will maximize SDG progress between now and 2030. Both of our speakers are leaders in championing gender equality and brings actionable solutions to the table. Ms. Melinda French Gates is the co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She is a long-time advocate for women's equality with a special focus on the care economy. And Ms. Sima Sami Bahus is the newly announced Executive Director of UN Women, who will shortly be taking up her office. She is a champion for women and girls who brings vast development experience to this new leadership role. Ms. Bahus, congratulations on your recently announced appointment as Executive Director of UN Women. In these complex times for the world with so many competing priorities, why is it that societies must spare no effort in ensuring gender equality? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your congratulations. I'm deeply honored to be announced and to be appointed as the Executive Director of UN Women. I must say that gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls is integral to all priorities. It is, in fact, the key priority in all our development efforts. To recover from COVID-19, or to accelerate and achieve the SDGs, or to ensure peaceful, prosperous societies, gender equality is inextricably bound up in all aspects of sustainable development. Actually, it is inextricably bound in all the competing priorities which you mentioned earlier, from health, from education, climate justice, peace and security. Everywhere, everything and everywhere has the key priority is today gender equality, and we cannot separate it from other challenges that the world faces today. The UN Secretary-General, as you know, has called gender equality the world's greatest human rights challenge and a prerequisite for a better world. The prioritization of gender equality was also clearly expressed in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which of course, as you all know, includes a dedicated goal number 5 on gender equality and related targets across the agenda. Gender equality is not only about women and girls, it is also about boys and men. We have seen, as you have mentioned also earlier, over the past 18 months, how women and girls were disproportionately affected by the socioeconomic fallout of the pandemic, and how COVID-19 has exacerbated gender inequality, pushing more women into poverty, pushing them out of jobs and away from access to educational and health services, including for sexual and reproductive health services and also for social protection. At the same time, the crisis has revealed and worsened the underlying inequalities that continue to shape women's and girls' lives today. Women have lost their jobs at a faster rate than men and have taken on more unpaid care work than ever before and have experienced greater gender-based violence in a shadow pandemic that spans the world today. At the same time, women have been at the forefront of the world's battle against COVID-19 as healthcare workers, risking their lives, record speed, as carers in families and communities, and also as leaders and public health leaders steering us through the very worst of times. Despite all that, and despite also the women being over 70% of frontline health and care workers, only 24% of the world's health ministers are women. Women hold just 25% of senior roles in health. Too often, services are delivered by women, but decisions are made by men, and we need to change that. We need to make sure that women participate in decision-making meaningfully and actively. Generally, the lack of women's representation at leadership level also is lacking. Only 22 countries around the world have a woman as a head of state or government, and just 21% of ministers are women today. Representation is critical for women's needs to be included in governmental decision-making, in policies, and also in planning. Also, I want to highlight the important situation that we are facing today for women and girls, the situation in Afghanistan. It shows us that we must continue to prioritize women's and girls' rights, their rights to education, to work, to health and social services, including protection services. We know today that many Afghan women and girls fear a return to a dark past and a generation of girls out of school. However, we also know that they fear losing access to basic health, education, and protection services. We all need to stand and work together to prevent reversal of the hard-won rights of Afghan women and girls and all women and girls around the world as a result of COVID. Finally, I would say that respect for human rights is a litmus test against which any authority must be judged, and respect for women's human rights is also a litmus test against which any authority must be judged. We believe that women's rights are human rights, and upholding them is paramount for societies and humanity to progress and prosper. UN Women will continue to engage and will stay and deliver everywhere where women and girls need help and support. On the economic front, we know that economies flourish when women are engaged. What is good for gender equality is good for the economy and society. We know that gender equality is possible. We must keep hope. We must have hope as the world learns to live with COVID-19 and starts to emerge from the crisis. There is a generational opportunity to use the recovery from this crisis to shape a better, greener, more gender equal and sustainable world with women and girls at the center and with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030 as our target. Thank you.
Well, Ms. Bowers, don't go anywhere. We'll come back to you in a second, but I thank you for creating really a runway for this conversation. I will also point out, you mentioned, women in leadership. I will point out that Norway is losing a leader. Germany will soon be losing a female leader. We've seen the president of Estonia recently step down, so I think those numbers might need to be amended. Ms. French-Gates, let's bring you in here. You've been waiting patiently. What do you see as the greatest barriers to advancing gender equality during the recovery and beyond? How do we overcome that? And I think speak broadly to the nature of Goal 5, right? The cross-cutting nature of Goal 5 and how that informs our success on all the 17 goals as it relates to the 2030 agenda. Over to you.
Sure. Well, and it's great to see Seema in this role in UN Women, and I think she's been very articulate about the issues. We saw what COVID-19 did was it laid bare the structural inequities that already existed in society. Women have been marginalized in their homes, their communities, the workforce for a very long time. And so when you look at what's been going on in our economies, you're seeing the International Labor Organization, for instance, is saying women are still going to lose 2 million jobs this year on top of the 13 million women that are out of work. And why is that? At the same time, men are going back to their jobs at a very swift rate. They're regaining their jobs. Well, the reason is that women's unpaid work and unpaid caregiving burdens have gone up while their job opportunities have gone down. And so we need to look at this barrier and figure out what is good policy that can help women with that unpaid care so that they can do what they want and return to their jobs. As a foundation, we really look at 3 key areas. We call them cash, care, and data. If you look at the economic recoveries going on around the world, cash means good social protection programs for women, putting money in women's hands. Caregiving means having good policies, so you subsidize childcare or you put policies in place like paid family medical leave. And by data, we mean collecting the data so that we can know exactly where to pinpoint programming as governments, as the private sector, as foundations, so that we can have a full and robust return of our economies. If we invest in social protection, we can lift 100 million women out of poverty. If we invest in the right way in caregiving, we can actually add 3 trillion of GDP across the world. So these are programs that countries should look at in policies, whether you're low, middle, or high income, so that you can get a full and just economic return. We've got to put women at the center, and we will get return to our economies that we want globally.
Let me stay with you, Ms. French Gates. In numerous conversations I would have with Ms. Bowers' predecessor, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, we talked about how good policy was important, but good implementation of policy was also very important, and that is always lacking in terms of the implementation of the targets we are seeking to achieve in Goal 5. That's an important peg, right? Good policy, but also the implementation. What do you make of that connection?
Well, I think you're exactly right. And so what we're seeing in country after country, we're seeing governments make investments. Let me give you a couple examples. For instance, in Kenya, they've made sure that there's more opportunities for caregiving. So there's a great micro business called Kidogo. It exists so that women can set up these businesses, but then 12,000 women have used this childcare during the crisis, put their children in childcare, and what we're seeing of the families and women who use that childcare service, they're actually getting a 24% return in their own income. We're seeing South Africa put in great social protection payments for families, and some specifically around childcare, because they know women can't go back to work if they have to care for their children at home. And lastly, Pakistan, at an enormous scale, has looked at digital finance, and they are making sure that women not only have mobile phones, but they know how to use them, they know how to use a digital financial account on their phone, and they put social protection payments through those digital accounts. And what we know from other countries around the world is you put those digital payments in the hands of women, they spend it on their family. And that's why governments want to get it directly in the hands of women. So Pakistan is building not just for now, they've got 16.9 million new families using digital money. They're putting in place now during COVID-19 something that will sustain them over the long term. That's good programming and good policy around the globe.
Ms. Bowers, let's just take the issue of childcare, right? This is not just a developing nation conversation. If you look at a country like the United States, you see this battle in the United States Congress just in terms of seeking to address paid childcare, given the inequities that were really highlighted in this pandemic. This is a global conversation, and it affects both the rich and the poor, not so?
Yes, of course. I mean, we need to really to look at the impacts of COVID-19 on children, also on women and on their households, and to make sure to understand fully that the impacts of crisis are never gender neutral, and they are always, whether they were in the humanitarian side or the climate or conflict related or COVID-19 related, it is no different. I think we should look at a fresh course where gender equality, environmental sustainability, and social justice, which is very important, is put at the center of economic recovery and transformation, and looking at families and looking at equal pay and looking at how women should be getting equal pay, not only in the US or everywhere in the world. And this would be our major goal and our major target, to make sure that social protection policies, as well as employment and fiscal policies, that they would be there to ensure protection for women and children and girls in particular in the face of shocks, in the faces of any pandemic or any humanitarian crisis or any conflict, and also across the life course. So basically what we are looking at and what we should be looking at is universal gender responsive social protection systems that must be strengthened, and that must be specifically looking at risks and challenges faced by women and by girls, and to see how best we can target them and how best we can look at them. One other solution is to make public investments in the care economy a key pillar of economic recovery, and this is extremely also important, where affordable quality care services are critical to support women and their children to re-enter into the labor force, of course, and the well-being of their children, and also of older persons, where women are also taking care of their older persons as well, and women can drive a job-rich recovery, hopefully. So we are looking at all this, and we hope that recovery will be soon. As I mentioned, we keep hope going, but we also keep working And we also keep calling for action, and we also keep trying to raise as much awareness as possible towards the issues. But as I always say, awareness is not an objective. Awareness is an objective only when it becomes an action.
And I think if the UN's development agenda has taught us anything, is that progress and recovery is not exactly a straight line, because as you're recovering, new problems emerge. Let me stay with you, Ms. Bowes. I want to talk a little bit about what happened in Paris earlier this year, the Gender Generation Equality Forum. What did that show us about global momentum towards gender equality, particularly when working across sectors and generations? I know they talked about this nuanced, different version of what multilateralism has come to represent, the different stakeholders. This was not just a government-driven process. It really was a bottom-up process. Just speak to what that taught us and where we go from here.
Absolutely. But let me first start by saying that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have played a unique role for the Generation Equality Forum as creative and robust thought partners, and also as well as practical and generous financial supporters. So thank you very much, Melinda. I also know that the team at UN Women has deeply appreciated Melinda's personal engagement and commitment vision throughout. As you all know, the Generation Equality is a multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together representatives across generations, which is important, from governments, from civil society, from youth organizations, including females, the UN system, private sector, philanthropies, to accelerate progress for gender equality and women's rights and support the accelerated full implementation of the Beijing Declaration, the Platform of Action of CEDAW, and also of the Decade for Action of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is a tremendous opportunity for the whole world to help women rise and to rise with women and girls as well. It is also, this initiative is also strongly anchored in the Decade of Action for the SDGs, and fully aligned with the Secretary General's recently launched common agenda as an agenda of action designed to strengthen and accelerate multilateral cooperation, ensuring that the entire 2030 agenda delivers for women and girls. And it is important to see it today, more than ever, because of the issues of multilateralism and a lot of question marks about multilateralism, how effective it is, and how good it has been, and how we can make it better. It is important to see that Generation Equality has succeeded in raising commitments, thousands of commitments to transformative action, and they have also been able, this initiative, to raise the largest financial investment to advance gender equality and women's rights ever in history. So this is important to say, that when you centralize the voices of a variety of actors, including civil society, including youth, including women, including girls, it brings success, and it also makes sure that everyone understands that gender equality is across sectors, and it can be done, it can be achieved, and the outcomes are important for us and will be important. Now, how to do it and to accelerate it and to make it maybe become more successful is to build concrete mechanisms and diverse partnerships, and to continue to maintain this building and this building of partnerships and diversity as well, so that we can sustain such initiatives throughout the coming years. And it is also important to realize that inspiration for the future is very important. And when you bring all these sectors and all these member states and all these actors together, and you leverage all the tools and all the digital platforms that are the major achievements of today, you see how much you can really do for women and for girls and for gender equality, and also for the SDGs and for realizing them. So meaningful engagement of young people, of young women, of all sectors, as I mentioned, of all women in all their diversity, of all young people in their diversity, being inclusive, and making sure that UN, member states, civil society, and inclusively of all other actors are working together to make sure that this process becomes a process that is sustained and that brings gender equality and the achievement of SDG 5 hopefully to the table by 2030, hopefully even earlier if we can do that.
I will say, Ms. Bowes, a lot of people are getting their first introduction to how you will approach your new role as Executive Director, and what we can see from your conversation is a lot of granular detail detail. It's data-driven, and I think that's very important to achieving Goal 5. Let me bring you back in high praise there, Ms. French-Gates, from the future Executive Director of UN Women for your role in terms of capacitating the Generation Equality Forum. Speak to the cross-cutting nature of what was done there and how that can inform how we approach the other goals.
Yes, I think one of the fantastic things that happened about the Generation Equality Forum was there were, as Seema said, these 6 action coalitions. And what they did work well over 18 months to work together to bring private business, to bring government, civil society, advocates together at one Zoom table. It all had to be done online because of COVID, but to really discuss what does good policy look like? What are good implementation programs? Where do we need more data? Just to give one example, coming out of the Economic Justice and Action Coalition, that group decided they wanted to carry on their work after the Generation Equality Forum, specifically around caregiving, because they know this is such a crisis for women, the caregiving piece, the unpaid labor that women do. And they're seeing good policy and programmings going in some countries. They want to make sure that gets shared across countries and that good implementation happens. So I was really encouraged to see that all this lead up and work that happened before the Generation Equality Forum will carry on. It's the only way we're going to ever get to some of those 2030 goals on gender equality. And so it was great to see those partners so enthused about their work that they're forming even these smaller task groups to keep pieces of it going.
Yeah, and as we look at this sort of from a macro level, it is about those smaller task forces. It is about localizing how you approach the various 17 goals. Localization, Ms. Bowers, is very, very important when it comes to gender equality because it's gender-based violence, for example, is happening within the household, within communities, and it's for those communities to resolve as opposed to perhaps having good policy from a national government, but they can't necessarily go into everyone's home where a woman is facing the fists of a man. Speak to that, the importance of localization.
I will tell you one thing. Nothing on the SDGs would happen and no achievement will be done, no significant achievement will be done unless we localize the SDGs and unless also people at the local level, at the grassroots level, understand the SDGs, understand how important the SDGs are for their lives, and can really be active participants and meaningful participants in the implementation of these SDGs. Nationalizing also the SDGs is also important, so that national policies and national programs and national initiatives will trickle down to the grassroots and to local communities, so that they benefit from the SDGs and the process towards achieving the 2030 agenda. And gender equality is, as we have always said, it is the one that is interrelated with every single SDG goal that there is. And we need to make sure that it continues to be this cross-cutting goal throughout all the goals. This is extremely important. Involving women at the grassroots level, at the local level, and having them understand how they can be actively engaged in the SDGs and in their implementations in their homes, in their schools, in their farms, in their yards, everywhere. It is also very important for us to be able to do that. And of course, we will not say that member states need to continue to work on policies, need to continue to work on plans, and also multilateral cooperation needs to continue to help countries who are in need, to help countries who are less fortunate, and to help the people of those countries who are less fortunate to continue to accelerate and to implement the SDGs. As we said earlier in this conversation, this is an all-of-society approach. Right. It is essential for all of us really to work on the SDGs and to achieve, so that we can achieve the ambitions of the 2030 agenda and to effectively build back better from COVID-19. This is extremely important for the United Nations, for member states, for civil society, for private sector, for everyone involved in wanting to see improving the lots of people everywhere and prosperity and peace in the world. Don't forget the issue of the SDGs as well, and the issue of 2030 is also very much interrelated and interlinked with building peace and security around the world, something that we all need and something that the United Nations and member states and everyone else involved wants to see happen. So, and as the Secretary General said in his latest report, our common agenda, it is a new whole of society, multi-stakeholder approach. It is the only way to overcome the challenges of our present time and to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs and realize the 2030 agenda, not least at the local level.
So as much as we talk about an all-of-society approach and about building back better, you have this momentum, right, from the Generation Equality Forum, but you still have the crosswinds from the current COVID-19 pandemic, and it really has set back the agenda. And remember, the pandemic has not gone away, and no one really knows exactly when that happens. There's a great deal of misinformation out there. There are these national fights that are happening in countries like the United States, but in countries around the world, my country, South Africa as well. What do you make of the scenario, Ms. French-Gates, where you have this momentum, you understand what needs to be done, there is good policy, but you have these crosswinds that are coming through factors that perhaps we cannot control?
Well, I think that's why this is exactly the right time to look at those crosswinds and see how we take them down. They have existed for a long time, but they're actually right here in our face right now because of COVID. We're seeing lots of kids out of school, so we're seeing more women home pushed out of their jobs. We're seeing an increase, as you said, in domestic violence. We know it from good data around the world. So this is why we have to put women at the center, the very center of every type of economic recovery. And for instance, in the United States right now, there's a piece of legislation that is moving through Congress to finally put paid family medical leave in the United States. It's been 30 years. The United States is the only industrialized country that doesn't have it. And guess what? It's extraordinarily popular with men and women. 70% say we need it in our country. So that is a huge crosswind, women out of their jobs, kids at home from school. But the government is saying, finally, we're going to take down this barrier. We're going to take down the barrier of caregiving from women so we can get a full economic recovery. That's good policy, and that's how we can stop these crosswinds and go back to work while we care for one another during an ongoing pandemic.
Ms. Baas, you're nodding. The pandemic of misinformation, right? On top of the pain and suffering that the other pandemic has wrought. Speak to that and what the UN and UN Women can do in that regard.
Well, I mean, yes, the pandemic of misinformation has been, another pandemic, another shadow pandemic.
Because it exacerbates the struggles we're already facing, right? If you do not deal with misinformation, you're not going to deal with the root issues that you're trying to address.
Absolutely, and it does not help because it doesn't show the right thing, it does not show the root causes, and it also makes people not understand the issues at all. So our partnership, for example, with the Gates Foundation, with Melinda in particular, on getting the right data is extremely important. UN Women has always been looking at the best data. We need to look at the data, more data for women, more data for girls. I know from my past experience that data on girls is largely non-existent in so many areas and in so many sectors. So we need to look at that and separate the data, disaggregate the data also to understand where the issues are. There are inequalities in data. There are also inequalities in even analyzing the data and finding out where we need to work on that and how we can also strengthen the programs coming from different data and different places. I think building forward better with data is important. I think also the UN has had a number of campaigns that were fighting misinformation, that were fighting sharing information that you are not sure of, and these are also important for the public. To know and to understand better what is the pandemic and how to deal with it. So building forward better will require, first of all, good information, good data, collaboration with all the stakeholders, placing women, as Melinda said, women and girls at the center of all aspects of the response and the recovery, including through gender-responsive laws, policies, and budgeting, and that is extremely important.
Did you want to jump in, Ms. French-Gates? Did I see a hand?
Yes, I wanted to give one specific example of how to combat misinformation. One of the things that when there was the horrible outbreak of COVID-19 that we all saw in India, that the Indian government did is they knew they had these women's collectives, that is groups of about 12 to 20 women that exist all over the country. And those women's collectives have long given health information and vital information to their communities. So they armed hundreds of millions of women with the right information about wearing masks and how to protect your family. And those women went out in their own communities and spread real information. That is a way that you put women at the very center. They know what's right for their families. If you give them the right information, as women have told me all over the world, even in Niger, they said, women talk. When we have the right information, we talk. We talk at the well, we talk at the births of the children, we talk when we're grinding millet. I know I talk to my women friends in the US. What are you doing with your family? How are you protecting your kids? Women talk and spread information, and women at the heart of this economic recovery can absolutely change society.
Sounds like localization works, Ms. French-Gates. I think that's a perfect example of that as well. Ms. Bowers, let me ask you this. We know, these conversations are also about best practice, so countries can learn from what has worked and what hasn't worked. We know from past crises and the successful experiences of some countries in poverty reduction, for example, and fostering balanced, inclusive growth that can help really set them on a fresh course. Are there some countries that you point to, in terms of this broader discussion and say, hey, look at what's happening here, look at the success there, and maybe transpose that and implement it where you are?
Well, I think one of the important issues that we were talking about today is social protection, and I think countries like Brazil, like Chile, like South Africa, like Togo have made efforts to close the gaping holes in social protection systems by experimenting with cash transfers for informal workers, which include, of course, many women, and strengthening access to unemployment insurance for domestic workers. This is an important and a very successful way of handling social protection systems. Also, Kenya and Senegal spearheaded public procurement programs that connect women, small-scale producers, to a predictable source of income and offer support to their livelihoods in times of crisis, as well as ensuring fresh and nutritious food for schools and hospitals. In other countries also, we see that women are given mobile phones, they are given access to credit, they are given access to more information, and and this also helps them to move forward with their families. And as we all know, when women are given cash or credit or any support, immediately they spend it on their families, on their kids, on their education, and on their health. So this also helps improve societies. Also, from our experience, we know that countries that had broad-based social protection systems in place were able to rapidly use and adapt existing schemes to extend coverage and increase levels of protection in the face of crisis. For example, in Europe, wage subsidies made up for over half of the earnings lost by the reduction in working hours, thereby mitigating increases in inequality. Some of the larger cash transfers in Latin America, for example, helped also to prevent women among recipients. So, I mean, many examples that we can bring from the world that are successful, and that we really also need to help integrate them into national care systems and national social protection systems that will help women and girls stay at the center of every development effort and every effort to recover and to rebuild.
I will just say, Ms. Bowers, your picture is getting a bit darker and darker. I'm not sure if there's a light that you can turn on for us, but let me bring Ms. French-Gates back in here. You've also traveled a fair amount around the world. Where have you seen best practice in terms of the broader conversation that might be applicable elsewhere?
Well, I think you see good practice in different areas around the world. You know, I would certainly say the Nordic countries very early on put in great paid family medical leave policies. And what you see now, 30 years on, is that not only do women take those paid leaves, but men do, and men participate longer with the child caring over time. And that makes an enormous societal difference, not just for women being able to go back to work, but for the care and the well-being of the child. So we see that. We see South Africa trying to put in really good programs around domestic violence. We see it in France. They made sure during COVID-19 that women could go to a pharmacy or even a grocery store to talk about domestic violence and report it in their own community. I see great examples, as I said, in India and Pakistan about using women's collectives, but also digital cash transfer payments to make sure social protection went into the hands of women. Those are all things that help families and help society, because we know when you invest in women, they invest in everybody else. And when you unlock women's potential and you help empower them and you take down these barriers of domestic violence or abuse, you take down the barrier of caregiving, then women can make sure that their families are fed, their children go to school, and that they work and bring in economic means to their family. And women will tell you all over the world, whether you're in India or Bangladesh, or whether you're in Niger, or you're in South Africa, whether you're in the United States, women will tell you that everybody in my family, everybody in my community looks at me differently when I bring income into my household. That is when you start to see real empowerment, because then that money gets funneled back into children's health, into their education, and into the family life. And that benefits not just the family, but the community as a whole and the economy. And so those are all things that we can look at around the world to say, how do we put good programming in with the right data so we know we're making the right investments that will really unlock women's full potential and empower them, and they're going to empower then everybody else and empower our economic recoveries.
I was hoping for another 5 minutes. I'm told to wrap, unfortunately. Let me thank you both. Ms. Melinda French Gates, co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Ms. Sima Sami Bahus, the newly announced executive director of UN Women, who I'm sure we'll be seeing in the corridors here at UN headquarters in the near future. Thank you so much for your insights and for sharing them with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Listening to all of you, it's clear that in order to return to a path of poverty reduction and prosperity, gender equality must be addressed as a matter of urgency. Thank you for your time, and thank you to you as well for those watching online. We are taking a break for lunch now, and we'll return for the second half of programming around 2 p.m. Eastern Time here in New York.